Chapter 1992. Unwittingly, the blind female zither player who was standing behind all the grandmasters suddenly stood still and placed the zither in front of her. Under the control of the chi of the woman whose mysterious finger attainments could rank in the top 3, the zither stopped in midair. The zither player listened to the sound of the wind with her eyes closed. Her thumb gently stroked the strings of the zither, and the speed at which her fingers landed on the zither became faster and faster. Every time the zither string vibrated, there would be an arrow exploding in the air around Shwe Songguan for no reason. After the ballisti shot out, a wave of stifling loud noises sounded from Northern Mang's middle army. A wave of pitch-black heavy rain immediately began to pour down from the great earth. Standing on top of the arrow, Huishan Zi raised his chin slightly. His gaze followed the wave of black clouds that was getting closer and closer to the majestic rain of arrows. At this moment, Shwe Songguan's unique hoarse voice sounded in everyone's ears, including Xianyuan Qingfeng. "Everyone, don't worry about what's happening above your heads." Then, an old Confucian scholar, Qing Baishuang, smiled and said, "Let this old man help Miss Shwe." This old southern Tang scholar, who was appointed to become a Confucian sage at Wudang Mountain's Little Lotus Peak, closed his eyes and listened to the clear and melodious sound of the zither behind him. He murmured, "Among all the instruments, the zither has the best virtue. Therefore, since ancient times, scholars have never removed the zither for no reason. Who would have thought that I haven't played the zither for 20 years? Shwe Songguan faced the wave of arrows that covered the sky and covered the earth. She took a deep breath and pressed her hands on the zither strings for the first time. When she strummed the strings with all her might, Qing Baishuang shouted, "Great music without sound. Great music without music." Tens of thousands of Beimang arrows stopped in the air outside the city, responding to the voice of the southern Tang scholar and the strings of the western Shu zither player. Shwe Songguan bent her little finger and hooked onto a string. She suddenly broke it. The wave of arrows that suddenly stopped in the air outside the city all shattered and fell straight down. The expressionless Shwe Songguan's mouth leaked a trace of blood. Qing Baishuang, who was extremely sensitive to people, turned his head and looked. The blind zither player, who had her eyes closed, shook her head slightly, indicating to the old Confucian that she was fine. Even though these Northern Liang and Liyang martial art masters were standing in front of the great army, Northern Mang's middle army still steadily advanced according to the established plan. This was especially true for the shield-wielding infantrymen at the front. It could be said that almost all of them were unafraid of death, their hearts filled with the resolve to die. Of the left and of the people. And it. Jian Guan of the Wu family's sword tomb carried a crossbow arrow on his shoulder. His hands were lazily placed on the arrow. Beside him, Jian Suihua was holding the Su of Gojoseon. On the other side, Mao Shulang finally unsheathed his sword. The name of the sword was De Joie. Ji Lu and held his sword in front of him. His finger gently flicked the sword. The sound was clear like the cry of a young phoenix. 10 steps behind the young Luo Yang were Mount Hui Xianyuan Qingfeng, Mount Hui Sui Xiagu, and Wudang Yuxingrui, the 3 martial masters. The 2 cavalry forces that had emerged from the flanks of the Beimang army suffered an absolutely unimaginable interception. It was absurd and tragic. Yu Groom and Lu Huang. Chai Qingshan and Wei Miao. Both of them blocked the 5,000 Beimang cavalry. The battle between the cavalry forces and the Jianghu experts had a similar effect. That is, it was all in one go. Then, what would happen if the battle between the cavalry forces and the Jianghu experts and neither side was willing to retreat? At that time, there was once the Sword Emperor of Shishu who held his sword and fought against the Su family's cavalry outside the palace gate. In the end, he was still trampled into meat paste. At that time, there were 4 people doing the same thing. Chai Qingshan and Wei Miao did not need to communicate. They chose to fight one at the front and the other at the back. If the former needed to take a breath, he would boldly retreat. The martial master behind him would take the opportunity to move forward and fill the position. One was the current sovereign of the Dongyue sword pool, the number 1 person in the southeast of the Liang dynasty. The other was the leader of the Nanzhao Wulin, the number 1 expert in the southwest. Chai Ching-shan wore a green gown and held a 3-foot sword. His aura was like a rainbow. If he held his sword vertically, the Beimang cavalry would be split in half. If he held his sword horizontally, the men and horses would be cut in half. Wei Miao was unarmed and only had a pair of fists. He was one of the few martial masters in the world. His might was even above Linya, the female martial master of Martial Emperor City. When Chai Ching-shan was about to run out of breath, his body leaned back slightly. He stepped lightly and slid backward. He did not seem to be in a sorry state at all. Wei Miao, who had accumulated power and was ready to act, took a step forward, just barely brushing past the sword Dao great master who needed to take a breath of fresh air. Wei Miao's fist smashed into the head of a northern Mang warhorse, smashing that tall and large horse until it immediately knelt down. The horseman threw himself forward, hacking out with his blade while risking his life. Wei Miao raised his arms and swept outwards, the 2 corpses of the horseman and warhorse respectively flying to the sides, smashing into the northern Mang cavalry on the left and right. When a horseman from the back smashed towards Wei Miao's head, Wei Miao bent his waist and leaned to the side, smashing his shoulder into the horse's neck with a ferocious stance, sending that horseman tumbling backwards. Then, Wei Miao's hands grabbed onto the warhorse's hooves, raising it high into the air. When Wei Miao killed more than 60 elite cavalrymen, he tapped the ground with the tip of his foot and flew backwards. Immediately after, Chai Ching-shan's sword rushed over, displaying the sword chi of Dongyue's high mountains and long rivers. Under Wei Miao's flawless cooperation, the 2 sword masters who had never met before did not allow the Beimang cavalry to advance even half a step. On the other side, the 2 proud disciples of Wang Xianji, who claimed to be the second in the world for 60 years, Wuwu City's Yu Groom and Lu Huang, were even more radical than Chai Ching-shan and Wei Miao. If the latter could block the charge of the Beimang's 5,000 cavalrymen, then these 2 were simply arrogant to the point of being unreasonable. Yu Groom and Lu Huang, one on the left and one on the right, did not take out their cold sabers for the time being. They each used Shudao's Fuji, 2 heavy weapons, showing an irresistible force. The more they fought, the braver they became as they continued to charge forward. The sword in Lu Huang's hand was called Shudao. The path of the sword was unpredictable and untraceable. Every time it slashed horizontally, diagonally, and directly back, it was fierce, and incomparably domineering. Whether it was the Beimang warhorse or the armored cavalrymen, under one sword, only death awaited them. Chapter 1993. On the other hand, Yu Groom, who was favored by Wang Xianji in terms of swordsmanship, was the first disciple of the martial saint who did not like to fight for fame and fortune. Therefore, he was not famous in the Central Plains Jianghu like Men Linya. However, Yu Groom's cultivation was unquestionable. No matter if it was the young king Su Fengnian or Huyan Daguan, who replaced Chao Chongqing as one of the 4 grandmasters of martial arts evaluation, they all believed that Yu Groom's true strength was the closest to Dong Tai in the world. If they were to talk about who had the most hope to stand shoulder to shoulder with the 2 old and new sword gods, Li Chungang and Dong Tai on the peak of swordsmanship, it would undoubtedly be Yu Groom who had the greatest hope, and not Qi Xianxia of Longhu Mountain, who also had an outstanding foundation and gave up the old swordsmanship and chose to break and rebuild. This gentle gentleman who seemed to smile at everyone and was refined and courteous, his martial arts future was vast and immeasurable. The majority of Yu Groom's sword attacks were relaxed and casual, like the common people in the marketplace who were watching a bustling scene. He had truly reached the natural realm of doing as he pleased. However, every seemingly careless pointer would cause a rider to fall off his horse and die. There was not the slightest wound caused by the long sword on the corpse. However, compared to Lu Huang's bold moves, the leisurely Yu Groom's chiseling speed was clearly a level slower. In front of him, Lu Huang turned around and casually lifted the head of a Beimang rider with his sword. He smiled at Yu Groom behind him and said, "I killed 16 more riders than you, how is it?" The calm and composed Yu Groom smiled and said, "A thin stream is long." Lu Huang snorted coldly and turned around to continue killing the enemy. After his junior apprentice brother Lu Huang turned his back to him, Yu Groom still had the mood to stand on his tiptoes and look at Wei Miao and Chai Chingshan's battlefield. Seeing the 2 Jianghu seniors working together, he nodded to himself. His and Lu Huang's rude and unreasonable advance was not because they were swayed by their emotions. These fellows who were born in martial Emperor's city, under the supervision of their master, almost all of them had been diligent in fighting the tide since they were young. Therefore, their one-breath qi was rather vigorous and thick, which gave them an innate advantage. Under the premise that their qi was not too different from martial artists of the same realm, he, Lu Huang, Linya, Gong Bonk, and the others might have already changed their qi 3 times, but they only needed to change their qi 2 times. Bridegroom Yu lowered his head and gazed at the hilt from the tide-listening pavilion's armory. He couldn't help but feel a bit sad. A peerless sword had fallen on the battlefield. Wasn't it a bit unfortunate that it was born at the wrong time? Yu suddenly laughed out loud and sheathed his sword. At the same time, he unsheathed his cold saber. His figure suddenly rose from the ground and moved freely on the back of the Beimang cavalry. Picking up the heads of those who died with their eyes open, Yu, who had always been reserved, laughed boldly for the first time. Lu Huang, how about changing your saber? On the battlefield, taking people's heads with a cold saber is the same as breaking the tide on the city wall when we were young. It can be said to be the 2 greatest things in the world. In front, Lu Huang sneered, wait until my Shu Dao sword is broken. Yu joked, a rough man who doesn't understand romance, no wonder he can't find a woman to warm his bed. Lu Huang didn't pay attention to this senior apprentice brother's teasing, but his sword was even fiercer and more decisive. In the center of the battlefield, for some reason, the king of feudal lords, the peach blossom sword deity, and the white-clothed Luo Yang stood still at the same time and looked to the north. The 3 of them were not only waiting for the Beimang infantry to approach, but also secretly looking for the real enemy. The young king of feudal lords finally looked at the Beimang's dazzling banner in the distance and said softly, then I'll go first. The white-clothed Luo Yang didn't say yes or no. The peach blossom sword deity Dong Tai pushed his sword out of the sheath with his thumb and said flatly, I'll help you find Tuoba Bodhisattva first. When the king of feudal lords was about to disappear in a flash, Luo Yang finally said slowly, after Tuoba Bodhisattva makes a move, you don't have to worry about your back, just open the formation and move forward. Su Fengnian nodded and disappeared into thin air. The next moment, the young king of feudal lords appeared above the Beimang infantry formation and stepped on a big stone that had just been thrown by a giant catapult. The boulder that weighed several hundred kilograms first froze in place for an instant before smashing back to the ground at an even faster speed. Not only did it smash the catapult into pieces, but the boulder also rolled down like thunder, crushing dozens of catapults on the spot and turning them into a bloody mess. The white-clothed Luo Yang closed her eyes and sniffed gently. The battlefield of the Great Qin Empire 800 years ago was so bloody, and the battlefield 800 years later was still the same. She whispered, the Great Qin's Luo Yang is here. Dong Tai finally found the target behind the layers of iron armor. He slightly leaned his body and then gently flicked the sword with his thumb on the hilt. The Taiya sword that had never followed the peach blossom sword deity out of the Wu family's sword tomb was finally unsheathed today and could show its peerless charm to its heart's content. This flying sword was too fast, the sword chi was too long, and there was too much sword will. As a result, a thin and dazzling white rainbow stretched out between the scabbard on Deng Taiya's waist and the flying sword. It was as if there was a sword in the world that was 2 miles long. The young sword crown Wu Luding, who was unwilling to fall behind, chuckled and said, Suehua, as a sword servant, just stand behind me and watch how I open the formation. Right when Wu Liuding's wrist shook and was about to use the crossbow bolts as greatswords to open up the formation, he saw a violet-clothed figure madly collide into Northern Mang's foot formation with an invincible bearing from the corner of his eye. Countless shattered iron shields and severed limbs sprayed into the surroundings of that ball of violet light, and it was like countless scarlet-red flowers had bloomed. Wu Luding couldn't help but mutter. This crazy woman. Under that large banner, Northern Mang's crown prince His Highness passed down the order, ordering Murong Baoding and Zhong Liang to each lead 2,000 private cavalry to reinforce the 2 cavalry units that were stopped. They had to bring back the heads of those 4 Central Plains grandmasters who dared to stop a chariot with mantises. Every head was equivalent to the head of a lower 3rd-rank general in the Northern Liang border army. Then, in front of the banner, he purposely cleared out a wide space with a radius of 1 mile. It was obvious that he was not afraid of the grandmasters from the Central Plains breaking the formation. Northern Mang's crown prince acted so boldly, but regardless of whether it was the experienced and prudent West River Province's disciplinary magistrate Helian Weiwu or the shrewd Aquarius Province's disciplinary magistrate Wang Yong, none of them had the slightest objection. Even Broken Spear Deng Mao, who was in charge of the crown prince's safety, remained indifferent. Everyone was calmly waiting for the appearance of the young king. The calm and unruffled crown prince of Beimang turned his head and asked the crown princess, who won first place in the chess and sword music school with the surname Gu Han, with a smile, "Do you think that Su Gai dares to come?" Her face was cold. Of course. The Northern Mang crown prince's face was filled with disapproval. It's good that he's here. It just so happens that this Northern Yang king understands a principle. There are millions of miraculous medicines in this world, but there is no medicine for regret. She stopped talking and sighed softly. Before marrying into the royal family, she had read all the poems and books in the Central Plains. It seemed that heroes always died at the hands of ambitious people. However, she glanced at the man beside her who finally held great power and sneered. She thought, Butcher Su Shao is an ambitious person. As the eldest son of the first wife, Su Fengnian is going to die at the hands of such an idiot. It's too pitiful. Helian Wue, the Beimang holder Wang Yong, had a complicated look in his eyes. The old man thought of the hidden plan that he had only learned about last night and sighed. It's just like this to have the whole world as your enemy. The old man who stopped his horse not far from the crown prince of Beimang collected his thoughts and looked at the open space in front of him. He was very emotional. He hoped that the young man would come here and fight bravely, but he also did not want him to die in grievance. But the young vassal king who had broken through 2,000 armors by himself had finally arrived. Chapter 1994. In the middle of Beimang, the attacking army was divided into 3 groups. 2 of the gaps were about 60 paces wide, allowing the cavalry to pass on orders or provide reinforcements. It was also convenient for the military to monitor the subsequent siege weapons. The 3 groups of troops were divided into groups of 10,000 infantrymen, with a 4 feet tall Beimang commander's flag as the backbone. If the Beimang emperor were to personally lead the battle, according to the law, the flag should be 6 feet tall. On this battlefield, the crown prince of Beimang was the commander-in-chief as the regent of the state, so his flag should be 6 feet tall. The rest of the generals, such as Murong Baoding, Helian Wue, and Zhong Shentong, were the top-ranking officials of the grassland. Their commander's flag could be 5 feet tall. The generals with real power and the commanders of the Jia army would use a 4 feet tall commander's flag. The flag could be embroidered with the surname of the commander or the battalion number. The 2 capitals of the Norland and the Southern dynasties had no restrictions on this. Although the first 3 groups of 10,000 infantrymen were intercepted by several grandmasters of the Central Plains, they generally maintained their formation and continued to push forward. Each group of infantrymen had elite soldiers with large shields and heavy armor as the vanguard. This group of people did not carry any weapons. The grassland cavalry were familiar with bows and horses, and their riding and shooting were the best in the world. It had long been known throughout the Central Plains during the Dafeng dynasty. If they were already like this on horseback, they could not be underestimated. However, there were not many archers in the 3 groups of infantrymen. Each group only had about 1,000 people. The main force was still the 5,000 infantrymen. They wore light leather armor, held light round shields, and had a long saber on their waists. They followed the scaling ladders as they pushed forward quickly. After all, in Beimang's strategic plan, there were a total of 2,400 catapults in the large arc that stretched across the battlefield behind the 30,000 people. In addition to the cavalry on the 2 wings continuously suppressing the north wall with their archery, there were also infantrymen behind the 3 groups of infantrymen. A total of 6,000 people were responsible for driving the arqueballistas, large yellow crossbows, and ape-arm crossbows. These types of crossbows had once shown on the battlefield of the Central Plains. During the mighty journey of Hong Jia to the north, there were family members who were in charge of the eastern Vietnam and the Tang Empire. They were directly promoted by the Empress of Beimang to the second class of the Southern Dynasty because they offered crossbow craftsmanship to Beimang. They quickly stood out among the many remaining families of the spring and autumn period. Other than that, the three groups of formations were equipped with more than a dozen siege towers. Each siege tower could hide more than 300 archers and infantrymen. They were like a moving ant nest. The exterior was covered with a huge special cowhide that was difficult to penetrate. Even the terrifying arqueballistas on the city wall of Beimang that were far more powerful than the Southern Dynasty's arqueballistas could not easily destroy the siege towers. Once they got close to the city wall, the archers in the towers could directly shoot at the soldiers guarding the city. At the same time, they would set up scaling ladders like a floating bridge. They would cooperate with the densely packed soldiers below the city wall to attack the city wall, and the elite dare-to-die warriors would use the arrows nailed into the city wall to climb up. One front and two back, plus the catapults, large crossbows, and the cavalry on the two wings, it could be said that it was impossible to defend against. However, because of the appearance of the 18 people, the battlefield did not take place on the north wall of the majestic city on the northwest border. The young lord took the lead to break through the formation and went deep into the heart of the Beimang army. Luo Yang followed closely behind him. Although she did not kill anyone, the new Lord Liang did not have to worry about anything. In the end, Su Fengnian was able to break through 2,000 people's armor. He used his two sleeves, the green snake, and the sword Qi rolling dragon wall. His gang Qi was like a swimming dragon. He charged straight into the front line of the Beimang army, as if he was going to take the head of the general in the midst of thousands of soldiers. Compared to Su Fengnian's powerful attack, the peach blossom sword god, Dong Tai, who was slowly moving forward, was much quieter. After the Taiya sword was unsheathed, it suddenly appeared and disappeared in a flash. In the thunderous clouds, there was a ferocious flood dragon occasionally glaring with anger. Before the peach blossom sword god, Su Fengnian and Luo Yang rushed in one after another, followed by Mount Hui Zi and Red Robe Su Ying. The Beimang troops in front of Dong Tai were already in a mess. Almost no one dared to provoke the Zhongyuan Wushu Grandmaster who had fought Tuoba Bodhisattva to a draw. When Li Chungang was alive, he lent his sword to Dong Tai. Although the battle was not clear, in the eyes of the Jianghu Grandmasters of Beimang, Dong Tai was the most powerful man in the world. At that time, there were rumors that there might be people in the world who could surpass Dong Tai, but as long as it was a battle of life and death, no one in the world could defeat Dong Tai. At most, both sides would die. Now that Dong Tai had returned from a visit to the East Sea, the peach blossom sword god, who had never carried a sword to travel the Jianghu, was carrying a long sword. Therefore, who would dare to act rashly in front of this swordsman? Dong Tai did not deliberately kill the Beimang soldiers. His pace was not fast, and he moved forward steadily. The soldiers on both sides of him moved south, but Dong Tai ignored them. He was using the Taiya sword to search for traces of Tuoba Bodhisattva. The situation was somewhat similar to when he chased Xia Guanyin from the north to the south for thousands of miles. However, compared to Xia Guanyin, who had almost no power to fight back, the Beimang god of war, who was at the peak of the human world in terms of both state, physique, and combat strength, was obviously not the same. He was just deliberately avoiding the battle. Dong Tai was not in a hurry. He occasionally looked around, and wherever his mind was, that was where the rainbow of sword aura bloomed. In the Beimang infantry formation where Dong Tai was, the red and purple colors seemed to have entered a no-man's land and killed wantonly. The red-robed Su Ying's body was agile. She liked to fly above the Beimang soldiers, and did not mind being a target at all. Every time she was faced with a barrage of arrows from the hundreds of archers in the formation, one could vaguely see her scarlet robe shuttling freely through the rain of arrows. She spun nimbly, and it was a beautiful sight. Every time she rolled her sleeves, 6 to 7 arrows would be caught, and as her body spun, she would immediately return the arrows. She did not care about the accuracy of the arrows. She only treated it as if it was a butterfly playing in a flower bush. The arrows came and went, but they did not even scratch the corner of her clothes. However, no less than 70 Beimang archers had their heads or chests pierced by her arrows. As for the soldiers who were caught in the crossfire, there were more than 200 of them. Although Su Ying's chi was not known for being robust, it was especially long-lasting. Every time she landed, she would either raise her body and step on several arrows in succession, twisting and turning as if she was walking on flat ground, or she would drop slightly and land lightly on the head of a Beimang soldier. Her stomp was like a naughty child stomping on a tangerine in a fit of pique, easily crushing the head of a Beimang barbarian. When a soldier saw the scarlet robe sweeping towards him, he could only close his eyes and slash randomly with his saber. He did not even have the extravagant hope of hitting the woman who moved like a ghost. In the next moment, he suddenly realized that no matter how hard he tried, the saber he raised high in the air could not be brought down. The Beimang barbarians around the soldier looked as if they had seen a scourge. They quickly scattered, leaving behind this pitiful worm who was temporarily at a loss. When he opened his eyes, he was shocked to find that the scarlet-robed woman was standing on the tip of his saber. The woman's embroidered shoes were standing on the tip of the saber, unmoving as she looked down at him. With a light tap of her feet, the saber's hilt instantly pierced its owner's chest and came out of his body. She then used the momentum to lean back, barely dodging several arrows that were shooting towards her face. The scarlet-robed Su Ying, who was originally facing the ground with her head down, waved her sleeves before she landed on the ground. Her feet landed lightly on the ground, but before she could even step on the ground, she charged forward. She raised her hand and revealed an arm that was as fair as a lotus root from her sleeves. She pressed her palm against the forehead of a Beimang soldier. The latter flew back a dozen or so steps like a kite with its string cut. The 3 soldiers behind him were crushed in the chest by the tremendous force of the impact and died on the spot as well. This time, Su Ying didn't dodge a swift arrow that was shot straight at her. A smile appeared on her joyful face. She stretched out a finger and gently pressed it against the tip of the arrow. The arrow didn't slow down in the slightest, but it didn't shoot into the woman's neck as expected. Su Ying's figure flashed back as fast as lightning. She waited until the arrow had exhausted all its strength before she stood still. She flipped her wrist and gently grasped the arrow that should have fallen to the ground. She broke into a smile and raised her eyes to look at the archer who had shot the arrow. Although the Beimang soldier's attire was no different from an ordinary archer's, it was obvious that he had already reached a higher level in the martial way. The strange archer who was currently facing the scarlet-robed Su Ying had a cold expression on his face. He had originally reached behind his shoulder to pull out an arrow from his quiver, but he probably realized that a strong bow shot was too insignificant for a grandmaster. He withdrew his hand and drew the saber at his waist instead. When he made this move, a dozen or so archers around him also abandoned their bows and drew their sabers. Su Ying stretched out a finger with a smile and slowly hooked it at the soldier. This person was an elite soldier of the border army of the Southern Court. Whether it was cavalry, archery, or infantry, he was extremely skilled. He was regarded as a valiant soldier by the Beimang. Even if this kind of valiant soldier joined the army of the Northern Court on the grasslands and attached himself to the nobles, he would definitely be regarded as a treasure by any Chiliarch. They were usually in groups of 10 and hid among the infantry attacking the city, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Not only were they familiar with fighting in pairs, but they were also good at small-scale formations against the enemy. These secret border soldiers of the Southern Court, who were usually scattered among the armies and only under the command of the commander-in-chief during wartime, were far fewer in number than the 20,000 infantry attacking the great cities and towns of the Central Plains. There were less than 4,000 of them, so they had always been complacently praised as the Chia Shui army of the Southern Court. These valiant soldiers of the Southern Court, who were said to be comparable to the White Horse crossbowmen of Liangzhou, were currently hiding more than 100 people in every 10,000 infantry formation, so there was only one centurion. Unfortunately, the one who was provoked by the scarlet-robed Su Ying happened to be that centurion. Chapter 1995. The centurion stared fixedly at the scarlet robe. After a slight hesitation, he made up his mind and raised his left arm, clenched his fist, and punched his right palm several times. After he made this gesture, apart from the dozen or so retainers, the other 9 squads of elite Southern Dynasty soldiers hidden in various parts of the infantry formation quickly received the emergency report and quickly gathered here, attempting to encircle and annihilate Su Ying. Su Ying, who sensed the abnormality, was eager to give it a try and patiently waited. If the scarlet-robed Su Ying was more like a child who played around without any distracting thoughts, then Xianyuan Qingfeng's murderous intent was extremely strong. Perhaps in the entire vast battlefield outside of Bibus City, only the young vassal king who broke through 2,000 iron armors in a row could win. Xianyuan Qingfeng rampaged through the Great Snow Plateau in an extremely domineering manner. Unlike Su Ying, who only needed to wander around, and generally only needed to keep moving forward, this Great Snow Plateau Jianghu Alliance master's target was extremely clear from the start: the enormous siege towers. It was obvious that she would tear down whoever was the biggest eyesore in her vision. In the vast Liang dynasty, she was indeed the most unreasonable woman in the entire Liang dynasty. The first siege tower was broken in half by the purple-robed woman. After passing through the first siege tower, Xianyuan Qingfeng turned around and directly pounced on the second one. When she tore open the cowhide and entered, corpses flew out in all directions. In the end, when she finally appeared on the top floor where she had a wide view, none of the 300 soldiers in the siege tower survived. Intentionally or otherwise, she cast a glance towards the Northern Mang army's battle situation. Then, she stomped down heavily. The moment she leapt out of the tower chariot, the sturdy tower chariot that came from the Southern Dynasty's military weapons supervisor collapsed with a loud rumble. The third tower carriage's luck was a bit better, having Xianyuan Qingfeng's palm strike land on that enormous cowhide. That wave of majestic aura actually shook the entire tower carriage until it was on the verge of collapse. A purple-clothed man entered the watchtower again. The 6 or 7 Northern Mang soldiers didn't even have time to take action before they were smashed through the railings by Xianyuan Qingfeng's sudden and abundant aura. Before they even landed on the ground, they already died while bleeding from their 7 apertures. Xianyuan Qingfeng glanced back at the North Jeju City's drum platform. She was a bit dazed when she saw the snow-white color. The siege tower beneath her was still swaying under the influence of the lingering aura from before. However, at this moment, several arrows shot out from the observation deck of the siege tower, interrupting this purple dress of Mount Insignia's thoughts. She frowned and didn't even turn her head. She casually waved her sleeve, and the arrows flew back along the path they came from. The 4 arrows were so fast that they couldn't be seen by the naked eye and instantly pierced through the chests of 4 archers. After killing them, Xianyuan Qingfeng clearly still hadn't vented her anger. She lightly twisted her ankle hidden under her skirt, and the entire siege tower completely tilted towards the one on the right. Xianyuan Qingfeng no longer paid any attention to the 2 tragic siege towers that had crashed into each other, because she discovered that Northern Mang's side finally couldn't hold back anymore. Apart from 2 groups of powerful and well-armored elite cavalry that rushed to the left and right flanks to attack the groom, Lu Huang, Wei Miao, and Chai Qingshan, the 4 grandmasters of the Central Plains, the movements at the center of the army weren't small either. Moreover, their targets included Xianyuan Qingfeng. Apart from the cavalry that numbered around 1,000, after leaving their original encampment, they charged towards the south through the gaps between the 2 paced corridors. There was also a group of black-clothed figures that didn't wear armor, only carrying blades and crossbows. Their movements were concealed, and they didn't appear on the 2 wide corridors. Instead, they lowered their heads and bent their waists as they quickly advanced through the narrow gaps between the paced corridors. There were also figures that originally came from the rear of Northern Mang's army. They had all sorts of weapons in their hands, and their attire was also greatly different. They didn't carry any of Northern Mang's border army's standard equipment, so they should be Northern Mang Jianghu experts who had mobilized in full force and then been recruited by the Northern Mang Imperial Court into the Southern Expedition Army. In the past few years, the grandmasters who could do whatever they wanted in the Jianghu of Beimang all ended up rather miserable, especially in the large-scale invasion of the Beiliang Frontier Army. The Daoud sect, Chess and Sword Music School, Tibing Mountain, and Princess Tomb were all severely damaged, especially Princess Tomb and Tibing Mountain. If it weren't for the support of Beimang, they would have been removed from the list of sects in Liang Lake, which was relatively estranged from the imperial court. They would have either been divided up by the joint efforts of other Jianghu forces who smelled the fishy smell, or their enemies would have kicked them when they were down. The Chess and Sword Music School didn't fare well either. Hong Jingyan, who was known as a CI master, died in battle. Huang Baozhuang, who was known as a CI master, or Luo Yang, who was known as a CI master, left the chess and sword music school. The master of the music school and the group of grandmasters who sneaked into Bailiang died in a foreign land. Apart from the peace order and the crown princess named Hangu, who was known as a CI master, the chess and sword music school, a deep-rooted sect, might be in the same situation as Xianyuan Qingfeng siege tower. With a little bit of force, the foundation that had been painstakingly accumulated over the past 200 years would collapse in an instant. Xianyuan Qingfeng saw that the three groups of people with completely different backgrounds only cared about heading south, but they chose to ignore the young vassal king and the white-robed Luo Yang who were deep in the enemy lines. This made the purple dress of Mount Huishan feel unhappy for no reason, and she became even colder. She continued to smash the siege towers. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a cavalry of 1,000 approaching from the south. Purple dress dashed toward them. Xianyuan Qingfeng slapped the helmet of the leader of the cavalry, and he was sent flying. His corpse shattered into pieces. Xianyuan Qingfeng, who had taken over the nest of a magpie, stood proudly on the back of the warhorse that was still galloping away. She looked down at the cavalry from above. This cavalry was none other than the elite force that Orange Province had spent countless efforts to train. The famous Winter Thunder Cavalry was also the main culprit that had dragged the left cavalry outside Bailiang into the quagmire. Xianyuan Qingfeng didn't know who was the first deputy commander of the left cavalry, Lu Dayuan, or the famous Winter Thunder Cavalry of the southern dynasties. She only lowered her head to glance at the astonished Winter Thunder Cavalry. Then, she looked up and saw a small cavalry of no more than 70 or 80 people. There was a dignified white-clothed swordsman, a woman in a colorful dress with her top fluttering on the back of the horse, and an old man resting with his eyes closed. Without exception, they were all people of the Jianghu. Without a leader, the Winter Thunder Cavalry didn't lose their morale. The cavalry closest to Xianyuan Qingfeng viciously raised his iron spear and stabbed at the abdomen of the purple-clothed cavalry. Xianyuan Qingfeng didn't waste too much time with this cavalry. She pushed off with the tip of her foot and flew up a little, dodging the iron spear. Then, she landed on the body of the spear and slid down. Before the cavalry could react, she suddenly looked up and kicked the man in the face. The cavalry's head flew off just like that. This tragic scene was shocking. However, Xianyuan Qingfeng didn't stop there. She allowed the humiliated Winter Thunder Cavalry to continue south. She floated up high and landed gracefully on the empty ground between the Winter Thunder Cavalry and the group of Jianghu experts. Xianyuan Qingfeng leisurely walked forward. Her footsteps were indescribably elegant, like a long ink scroll written by a Danqing artist. After Xianyuan Qingfeng's massacre, Su Yanbing, who hadn't made any big moves, suddenly said to Dong Tai's back, "I'm afraid I'll have to leave the matter of preventing Tuoba Bodhisattva from looting the burning house to you." Dong Tai didn't turn around. She smiled and said, "I won't let you down, Brother Su." Su Yanbing tilted the fine iron spear that the Tide Listening Pavilion had kept for many years. Facing the peach blossom sword god's promise, this Bailiang half-step martial saint didn't express any gratitude. He just cupped his fists and left. Su Yanbing turned around and strode toward the sword eater who hadn't made a move. He said in a low voice, "I'll have to trouble Senior Sui to coordinate with His Highness's return to the city." Sui Xiegu glanced at this junior martial brother of the spear immortal Wang Xiu. The old man didn't comment on Su Yanbing's request. Su Yanbing didn't force him either. He went to support the young sword-crowned swordsman from the sword tomb of the Wu family. Wudong's great spiritual master Yu Xingrui had already left to support Mao Shulang and Ji Lu, and the two grandmasters of Nanjiang. Wu Luding and the swordsman Suehua were still facing an entire formation of 10,000 men. Although they hadn't fallen into a certain death situation, they were already surrounded by layers of iron armor. For some reason, the female swordsman with outstanding swordsmanship didn't unsheath her Su of Gojoseon sword to kill the enemy even though she had seen the sword crown of the sword tomb's aura weaken many times and was surrounded by danger. She seemed unwilling to take the initiative to help Wu Luding share the pressure. In addition, the young sword crown was really like a newborn calf that wasn't afraid of a tiger. He buried his head in the formation and pressed forward with indomitable will, as if he couldn't wait to kill the Bei Mang crown prince. In contrast, Mao Shulang and Ji Lu, one of the few bladesmanship grandmasters in the world, were more steady. They were even able to greatly limit the speed of the entire attacking formation. The reason why Yu Xingrui, the master of the current Wudang sect leader Li Yufu, chose to support Mao Shulang and Ji Lu was reasonable. Firstly, it could greatly impede the Bei Mang's attack. Secondly, the young sword crown was too rash and radical. Yu Xingrui couldn't stop him even if he wanted to. After all, Yu Xingrui had long heard of the unreasonable rules of the withered swordsman of the sword tomb of the Wu family. Even if he was a kind elder and a martial arts senior, even if he had compassion in his heart, it would be very troublesome if he really helped. He was afraid that not only would he not be able to help, but he would also be superfluous. Chapter 1996. In the formation, the young sword crown from the sword tomb of the Wu family had his vision blurred by sweat. He held two sabers that he had casually snatched and had just repelled the dense saber formation of more than 100 Bei Mang soldiers. For a swordsman like Wu Luding, it didn't matter what kind of weapon he had in his hand. He took the opportunity to gasp for breath, shook his head, and lifted his sleeve to wipe his sweat. Looking ahead, the young man grinned. The so-called battle between masters was a battle of qi, which was the truth of martial arts. However, that was under the situation where both sides were evenly matched and there was no room for the slightest difference. But when it came to fighting on the battlefield, there was no such thing. For example, no matter how closely the Bei Mang soldiers and archers connected their attacks, there was no way that the young sword crown did not have a chance to breathe. However, this did not mean that Wu Luding had become a legendary enemy on the battlefield. This was because the depth of a martial arts master's qi was ultimately fixed. Not to mention the earth immortals, even the celestial state masters who could resonate with heaven and earth did not have an inexhaustible qi. Every time they breathed, it was just a reaccumulation of power. The speed of the qi in the body was definitely much faster than the speed of replenishment. Especially compared to Wang Xianji, Tuoba Bodhisattva, or Xianyuan Pan, the ancestor of Mount Hui, who were pure martial artists, whether swordsmen focused on sword intent or swordsmanship, regardless of whether they had reached the first level, their physique was inevitably not as strong as the former. Therefore, in the 500 years of Jianghu, the people who advanced the fastest were usually the gifted swordsmen. Previously, there was Li Chungang, the spring and autumn sword armor, and now there was Chen Tianyuan, the banished immortal of Taibai sword sect. On the other hand, although Wang Xianji, Xianyuan Pan, and the others had great achievements in the end and their combat strength was even more terrifying, the speed of their martial arts advancement was obviously slower. Since ancient times, there was a saying that there was no enemy on the battlefield. Why was it that only Bailiang Su Longxiang was expected to break the precedent? Of course, it was not because of how high Su Longxiang's realm was, but because he was born in the Vajra realm. On the battlefield, there was room for a martial Dao Grand Master to breathe again and again. However, as the qi in his body decreased, as long as the army had enough soldiers, the martial Dao Grand Master would naturally be exhausted to death. Of course, the young people of the Wu family, whose talent and constitution were the best among the Wu family's sword tomb, understood this superficial logic. However, he still insisted on breaking the formation alone. Wu Luding bent down at the waist, his back facing that female sword attendant who roamed the Jianghu with him. He released a heavy breath of turbid air, his expression a bit sentimental as he quietly said, "Suehua, I believe that I will never be able to compare to that fella surnamed Su in my entire life. I reckon that he has already slaughtered his way all the way to Northern Mang's great banner. Where am I right now?" The sword attendant Suehua nodded and did not say any comforting words. Wu Luding sighed, "It's really annoying. Do you remember that time in the reed marsh outside Xiangfan City? I could defeat 70 or 80 Bailiangs His Royal Highness with one hand?" The sword attendant Suehua's mouth curled up. Her eyes were gentle, "It should be." Wu Luding was silent. He clenched his two swords. Suddenly, the young sword attendant felt a palm gently pressing on his head. How could a man's head and a woman's waist be touched? However, Wu Luding did not care. The female sword attendant who gave the impression of being quiet and peaceful rubbed Wu Liuting's head. She opened her eyes and looked into the distance. She said softly, although I have always wondered why you wanted to compete with that young king, no matter what, since you are willing to admit defeat. Wu Liuting's eyes were firm. He shook his head vigorously and said, I don't admit defeat. The sword attendant Suehua retracted her hand and raised her arm to hold the Su of Gojoseon's hilt. Actually, there is something I have been hiding from you. Wu Liuting suddenly turned his head and said with a sad face, Suehua, don't say it, don't say it. If you tell me that you secretly like Su, where should I go to cry? The female sword attendant glared at him and then slowly pulled out the Su of Gojoseon. After brushing past him, she said softly, I am probably already a sword immortal on the land. Wu Liuting was stunned. Outside the big formation, Su Yanbing was not in a hurry to break the formation. In the face of the thick formation, Su Yanbing made a move that no one expected. As the junior brother of the spear immortal Wang Xiu, this martial arts master who was rarely mentioned in the Liang River Lake, suddenly stabbed the iron spear in his hand into the ground. Su Yanbing took a step forward. The iron spear was behind him and on his right side was the iron spear. It seemed that this man wanted to tell the 10,000 people formation. I, Bailiang, Su Yanbing, am here. No one in Beimang can pass the spear. At the back of the 18 masters who left the city was the blind female zither player from Shishu, Xue Songguan. However, it was precisely this young woman who seemed to be the furthest away from the battlefield that bore the heaviest pressure. Northern Mang's wave after wave of arrow rain that rained down on North Jailer City were all stopped by her and Qingbai Shuang, who had ascended to the great celestial phenomenon realm. It was to the extent that even the 2,000-plus stone catapult cart's boulders, the largest among them, were all shattered in midair by this female zither master who was merely at the finger-profound realm. The huge stones thrown by those large catapults driven by hundreds of people were like thunder. They were invincible and could sink 7 feet into the ground. His arrogance was extinguished by a woman with a slender waist and a delicate body, just like the spring wind and rain. Xue Songguan had already changed to sitting cross-legged. The zither was placed on her legs. 4 strings had been broken. The first string was broken by her. The next 3 strings were broken by Jia, Bai, and Fan respectively. The blind female zither player lowered her head. Her fingers were trembling slightly. There were drops of scarlet blood dripping from the body of the zither. She knew that her sacrifice was worth it. Although she was born an assassin and did not know much about war, before the siege infantry arrived, every wave of arrows that Beimang threw out to help the infantry suppress the city was equivalent to fewer casualties for the Bailiang frontier army in the North Jibei city. Xue Songguan slowly raised her head and looked with some confusion at the old Confucian who had come to her side. She knew that his surname was Qingbai Shuang. He was a scholar of the old southern Tang and a martial arts master of the southern border. The old man said with an amiable expression, Miss Xue, you are still young. You don't have to work so hard. Previously, you acted too quickly. This old man was worried about disrupting your qi and did not know where to stop you. Now, it will be up to this old man to do the work. Miss, it will be up to you to fill in the gaps. How about it? The blind female zither player gently shook her head. She was unusually determined. The old man did not find this strange. He waved his sleeve and smashed the boulders above his head with Haoran Qi. At the same time, he continued to persuade her with an amiable expression, Miss Xue, this old man is 2 generations older than you. Allow this old man to take advantage of his seniority and speak some great principles. This old man does not know why you are here and does not know who you are here for. But since this old man is fighting side by side with your little girl, there is no reason for a girl to die first. This is unreasonable and impolite, isn't it? The woman smiled gracefully. She seemed to have thought of this old man who also liked to speak reason. Some scholars, regardless of age, seem to be somewhat naive and cute. She still remembered that in the early years, Su and this old man Zhao had argued. In a fit of anger, Su spoke without thinking and asked the old man why he did not die for the country. She did not expect that this old man Zhao would confidently reply to Su Su that scholars should be strategizing for the emperor in the imperial court. That kind of dedication was the right thing to do. Fighting on the battlefield had always been the duty of a martial artist. Death was a worthy death. If I, Zhao Dingxiu, was a scholar afraid of dying on the battlefield, what was wrong with that? Su Su suddenly grimaced and was speechless. This old man Zhao leisurely left with his hands behind his back. It was just that the old man's back was somewhat bleak. Qing Baishuang laughed and joked, "Miss Xue, such a beautiful and rare girl like you, how can you not get married? Wouldn't that cause a certain man in the world to lose that great fortune? This old man Zhao is old. If I were 30 or 40 years younger, I would definitely write a beautiful poem and give it to you. A gentle and graceful girl is a good match for a gentleman." Xue Songguan blushed. Qing Baishuang restrained his expression and said, "Next, let this half-scholar old man put in more effort. Miss Xue, what do you think?" Xue Songguan did not know how to answer. The old Confucian scholar Qing Baishuang took a deep breath. The Confucian sages said, "Even if there are millions of people, I will go forward." It was the perfect scene. Suddenly, a strange phenomenon appeared in the world. A light pillar as thick as a mountain fell from the sky and completely covered the land in front of the Beimang Great Flag. It was like a snow-white waterfall that fell from the 9 heavens to the mortal world. At that moment, Tuoba Bodhisattva finally appeared. He stood less than 10 feet away from Dong Tai's flying sword. The Beimang god of war looked coldly at the peach blossom sword god. "I'm only here as bait. Actually, there's no need for me to kill Su Fengnian. The heavenly Tao will suppress it." Dong Tai's expression was solemn. He looked at the light pillar that continued to strike the ground from the sky. It contained a supreme dignity that did not exist in the mortal world. Dong Tai fell into deep thought. Tuoba Bodhisattva sneered and said, "Dong Tai, why don't we use this opportunity to determine the victor?" Dong Tai slowly retracted his gaze and finally looked at Tuoba Bodhisattva. However, he shook his head and sneered, "It's not my turn." Tuoba Bodhisattva immediately turned around. In front of the great northern Mang banner that was covered in dust, one could vaguely see that a black line seemed to have appeared between the pillar of light and the ground from the distance. Under the suppression of the heavenly Tao. Someone straightened his back. Chapter 1997. The Prince of Beimang, Yelu Hongkai, had cut through the formation of the army and went straight to the heart of the army of 400,000 Beimang. Yelu Hongkai, the crown prince of Beimang, had stopped his horse under the banner and didn't retreat half a step. The future king of the prairie didn't show any fear. Instead, his eyes were burning. It was like watching a fierce beast fall into a carefully arranged trap during the annual autumn hunt. The more it struggled, the more it would make the knights who participated in the hunt feel the pleasure of conquering. The crown prince, who had been mediocre for many years, had always been regarded as a puppet by the nobles of the prairie. They thought that he was just an ordinary person without any talent or strategy. Many of the royal family members who were angry at his incompetence even thought that he had tarnished the noble surname of Yelu. However, it was undeniable that the young man who had inherited 70% of the former emperor's looks and wore the dazzling armor that the former emperor always wore when he was alive. He was indeed like a god of war in golden armor on the battlefield. Yelu Hongkai held an exquisite dagger inlaid with several priceless gems in his right hand and gently tapped the scabbard on his left palm. He looked up and tried to suppress the excitement in his heart. His angular face was slightly stiff. This noble of the prairie who had endured humiliation for many years kept breathing softly. He was afraid that if he revealed any clues, the great grandmaster of martial arts commentary who rose like a comet in the world would stop at the edge of the cliff and cause his efforts to be in vain. Yelu Hongkai subconsciously narrowed his eyes. His mood was complicated. If the prince of northern Liang could be prefixed with the word young, then just like the emperor of the Zhao family in Liang, a young vassal king and a young emperor, they were both fully deserving of the title, young. This was because there was a gap of several years between them. However, Yelu Hongkai was different. He had long passed the age that the scholars of the Central Plains called getting married. He was 35 years old. According to the survivors of the southern dynasties, there was a saying in the Central Plains that people who lived in the 70s were rare. He knew that his martial arts talent was mediocre. Not to mention the few top grandmasters like Tuoba Bodhisattva, Hong Jingyan, and Sword Qianjin, even Zhong Tan, Li Fengshou, and Tuoba Chunsun of the same age were far inferior. Therefore, he had no chance to become a level 2 master and naturally couldn't enjoy the life extension after refining his body. In this way, half of his life was gone. Except for marrying the woman with a prominent background under the emperor's order and becoming a couple with the woman who was extremely boring on and off the bed, he remembered that at that time, most of the young nobles in the Norland were waiting to see him, the crown prince, become a joke. They were waiting for the woman who slept with him to openly keep a gigolo. However, the crown prince's wife, who won the title of 2 Words Poem in the chess and sword music school, was quite well behaved. She lived in seclusion and rarely went out. She didn't follow the example of those bold and unrestrained noble women who had an ambiguous relationship with eagle-like prairie men. She also didn't go to the western capital of the southern dynasties to hook up with some nobles. Other than that, it seemed that Yelu Hongkai didn't have any other outstanding achievements. As the crown prince of a country, the future leader of millions of cavalry in the grassland, how sad and pitiful it was to live like this. Yelu Hongkai couldn't help but look ferocious. His 5 fingers clenched the scabbard, and blue veins bulged. Finally, the young king of Liang didn't disappoint the crown prince. He killed a bloody path and stood still with a cold knife in his hand. Although he was surrounded by hundreds of thousands of soldiers, the young king still looked calm and handsome. This was probably the so-called handsome and elegant. Yelu Hongkai found that the jealousy in his heart was so strong. It was like the withered grass in the vast grassland at the end of autumn. If you threw a match casually, the grass would burn fiercely and endlessly. Even if he knew that the young man standing a mile away was a person who was going to die, he couldn't suppress this feeling. For no reason, the crown prince of Beimang wanted to drink the famous Bailiang green ant wine. He really wanted to drink it in front of the proud son of Liang Heaven. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, Yelu Hongkai, who was wearing a bright armor, squeezed the horse's belly. The intelligent Fergana horse gently stepped forward a few steps. The man and the horse left the shadow of the big banner. The crown prince of Beimang laughed and said, "What a great king of Bailiang. If you and I didn't meet on the battlefield, would have held your arm and talked with you. That's why I, Yelu Hongkai, would take out the best horse milk wine in the grassland and drink with you Su Fengnian until we are drunk." Behind the northern Mang crown prince were tens of thousands of heavily armored Xia Shui soldiers. When the 2,000 elite guards and cavalry closest to Yelu Hongkai heard these words clearly, most of them revealed strange expressions. They clearly didn't expect this crown prince, whose reputation wasn't good, to be so imposing and majestic. As a result, their gazes towards the back of that golden-armored figure retracted a bit of their disdain and contempt. After all, compared to the royal army of the Liang dynasty that was hailed as the son of heaven's heavy armor by successive generations of Zhao monarchs, the grassland's Xia Shui army had an even more transcendent status. They all came from the and beef families. Of course, this also had to do with the fact that there were relatively few Chinese in the southern dynasty while there were many large families in the Norland. In the western capital where the remnants of the southern dynasty gathered, as long as one was a descendant of the A and beef families, let alone a direct descendant, even a slightly talented and knowledgeable member of a side branch would often be able to secure a place. There was no lack of people who came from the C's and D's families to serve as important officials in the western capital. The reason why the old minister Yelu Hongkai, whose names sounded similar to the northern Mang crown princes, was still able to stand tall even after the empress seized the throne and ascended to the throne, was because this rotten old man who would be either dozing off or mentally wandering 10,000 li each time he held a meeting grasped the hearts of almost half of the Xia Shui army. Murong Baoding, who was known as the #1 relative of the empress, was supposed to be in charge of the Aquarius prefecture, which was an important source of food and war horses. However, in the end, he could only go to the Orange prefecture, which was ranked the lowest among the 13 prefectures. Undoubtedly, it was Yelu Hongkai and a large group of Xia Shui who secretly exerted force. Dong Zhuo was able to quickly stand out in the southern dynasty and eventually hold the military and political power at the same time. Of course, the contribution of saving the country in the early years was indispensable. However, marrying the woman surnamed Yelu was more important. His Majesty especially valued Dong Zhuo and constantly promoted him in hopes of alleviating the fierce conflict between the Murong and Yelu surnames to a certain extent. It should be known that in the past 400 years, there were many outstanding people in the grassland. It had always been, the one who got the Xia Shui army got the grassland. The biggest contribution of the king of the old northern courtyard, Su Huainan, was to assist the empress to break this iron law in the turmoil of internal and external troubles. He helped the empress, who was not a legitimate woman, not only to successfully sit on the dragon throne, but also to unexpectedly sit on the dragon throne. In the face of the bold words of the crown prince of Beimang, the young king of Bailiang, who was standing on the edge of the open space, was indifferent. He did not say any words of appreciation, nor did he take advantage of the situation to rush forward. He was always 1 mile away from Yelu Hongkai. Obviously, he had already broken through 2,000 Beimang armor, but when no one stopped him, he chose to not move. This made the Beimang infantry behind the young king and the Xia Shui army behind the crown prince of Beimang puzzled. Could it be that he had finally reached the point where he was an arrow at the end of its flight? Yelu Hongkai did not continue to urge his horse forward. He just raised the dagger that was passed down from the founding emperor of Beimang and pointed it at his own neck. He laughed loudly and asked, Su Fengnian, do you have the ability to take my head away? Chapter 1998. In today's world, how many people could ask a martial arts evaluation grandmaster if he could take his own head at such a close distance? As a result, the soldiers around that extremely daring northern Mang crown prince, regardless of whether it was the infantry or cavalry, when they heard these words, they immediately felt their blood boil. They really wanted to charge at that arrogant northern Liang king. It was a pity that the new Prince Liang was still unmoved, as if he wanted to retreat from the battle. Yelu Hongkai, who was sitting high on the horse's back, smirked. Within the orderly northern Mang army, this 1 li wide open space stood out abruptly and conspicuously. This was especially the case when it happened to be in front of the northern Mang Great Banner. Even a blind person would know that there were hidden mysteries. He believed that with Su Fengnian's ambitious and ruthless nature and cultivation as a martial scholar, as long as he didn't lose his mind or become extremely conceited, he definitely wouldn't recklessly take risks. Yelu Hongkai also didn't feel that a few words of provocation would be enough to successfully lure Su Fengnian, the backbone of Northern Liang's 300,000 cavalry, into a trap. However, there were some things that some people had no choice but to do. It was very simple. Yelu Hongkai knew why he was suddenly able to govern the country. Why was he able to control 400,000 troops in one night and lead them south to attack Beiming City? Could it be that Her Majesty, who had been cold-blooded all her life, suddenly became merciful and decided to hand over the grassland to him, using the merit of Beiming City to pave the way for her only remaining flesh and blood? Of course not. She never cared about the fact that even a vicious tiger wouldn't eat its own cubs. On the contrary, the reason why she supported him to the position of commander-in-chief of the southern expedition was because she wanted to use him as the world's biggest bait. She wanted to use 400,000 troops to force the young man named Su Xiao to come out of the city. At the same time, she wanted to make Su Xiao's eldest son feel that there was hope to capture the king first to capture the bandits. Therefore, as the crown prince and the commander-in-chief of the southern expedition, in the end, he only had Deng Mao by his side to protect him. Tuoba Bodhisattva, Murong Baoding, Zhong Shintong, Zhong Liang, Li Mibi, and the others were the few martial arts grandmasters left on the grassland. Yelu Hongkai could only order them to attack the city, but there was no way he could make them stay by his side and form an iron bucket formation. Otherwise, how could he be a qualified bait? Taking a step back, Yelu Hongkai didn't think that Beimang's 400,000-strong army would collapse if he died. He believed that with His Majesty the Emperor's methods and the arrangement of the peace decree, even if 10 Yelu Hongkais died outside Jibei City, the siege of the city would not be delayed. Speaking of which, while his relationship with the Emperor as mother and son was thin, there was still some left. For example, he had at least learned of the shocking plan last night, and he also felt that his victory was within his grasp. At this moment, Yelu Honkai was too lazy to look at the cautious young lord. Instead, he looked up at Jibei City in the distance and clicked his tongue in wonder. He didn't expect that so many grandmasters from the Central Plains would rush to the battlefield outside Liangzhou Pass. Otherwise, the grassland army would have already begun to climb the city. But this was also a good thing, a very good thing. Nearly 20 of the top martial arts grandmasters from the Central Plains died one after another outside Jibei City under the crushing of his own cavalry. This unprecedented achievement would be recorded on Yelu Hongsai's head. The Sword Emperor of West Shu died under the hooves of the Su family's cavalry. Although he died, it was a glorious death. The Spring and Autumn War had ended more than 20 years ago, but the Central Plains still enjoyed talking about it. They talked about the heroism of the Sword Emperor of West Shu and the cruelty of the Su family's cavalry. Think about it, Su Shao had led the army across the Central Plains for more than 20 years and fought countless soul-stirring battles. Why was it that the pacification of West Shu went so smoothly? The number of times he was mentioned in the streets was comparable to the Battle of West Wall and the Battle of Jinghe. Obviously, it was because the Sword Emperor of West Shu had single-handedly provided timely help. Including the king of Bailiang, Su Fengnian, there were 17 people on the battlefield outside Jibei City. 18 martial arts grandmasters whose names shook the Central Plains. Only then did Yelu Hong retract his gaze, slowly drawing out his dagger. Under the illumination of the sunlight, the unsheathed dagger sparkled with radiance. This northern Mang crown prince lowered his head to look, narrowing his eyes as he stared at the blade that was as smooth as a mirror. He suddenly had a thought. After this battle, he should engrave 4 characters on this dagger. Return to the mandate of heaven. Su Fengnian looked at the empty field. For some reason, he looked as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He was not afraid of this trap appearing here. He was only afraid that it would be placed near Huayang Pass. He was afraid that the bait would not be this arrogant crown prince of Beimang, but the Bailiang Protector General Chu Lushan who was facing off against Dongzhuo's army. Su Fengnian held the cold blade in his hand tightly and disappeared in an instant. Deng Mao had already taken out the broken spear that was less than 3 feet long from his bag. When the young feudal lord disappeared, he took a step forward and landed on the left side instead of in a straight line. The next moment, Deng Mao slid back 7 or 8 steps. The entire sleeve of the arm that held the spear spurted out scarlet blood. Under the collision of the cold blade and the broken spear, a visible ripple of chi activity rippled like a vertical mirror. Under the huge impact, not only did the banner behind Deng Mao flutter, but even the extremely tough flagpole bent back at an astonishing angle. If Yelu Hongkai did not have Deng Mao in front of him to block most of the Qi, and Han Gu, who was the champion of the 2-word poem, dismounted from her horse and held her sword in front of Yelu Hongkai, this crown prince with an ordinary physique would have died on the spot. Chapter 1999. Deng Mao stared at the front with firm eyes. After the young king was repelled, he was standing on the edge of the open space. Compared to Deng Mao's arm that was full of blood, Su Fengnian just shook his wrist and waved his sword, dispersing the remaining force. Obviously, he was more at ease. The man in white in the distance reminded loudly, "Be careful when Deng Mao throws away his spear." Su Fengnian frowned. Deng Mao, who was exposed, didn't get angry. He just grinned and didn't care. Su Fengnian didn't pay much attention to the broken spear Deng Mao that he fought for the first time. It wasn't because he was conceited, but because he was confident. Deng Mao and Hong Jingyan's martial arts cultivation were relatively close, and even lower than Hong Jingyan in the Longyan Plains. After all, the chess and sword music school showed that he was about to break through the threshold and enter the celestial realm. It was just that Su Fengnian didn't give Hong Jingyan a chance to stabilize his realm. Otherwise, Beimang would have one more Earth Immortal. Su Fengnian thought of the words, Earth Immortal, for no reason. His heart was a little heavy. He seemed to be casually looking around, but at the same time, his mind was turning rapidly. It was a publicly acknowledged fact that the pugilistic world was welcoming a once-in-a-thousand-years great year. The Liang River Lake was far more prosperous than the northern Mang. Even the Empress of the Northern Mang had publicly declared in the imperial court that regardless of the number of martial artists in the first class Vajra finger, mysterious celestial phenomenon, or third class, after Huang Longsha transferred the remaining fate energy of the 8 kingdoms of spring and autumn into the pugilistic world, the Liang martial arts circle, which seemed to have pulled up seedlings to help them grow, began to far surpass the Northern Mang. Even the land immortals were obviously more in the Liang martial arts circle than in the Northern Mang. Even if the great immortal Yuan Qingshan of the Kailan sect, who had ascended before, and the Order of Peace of the Chess, Sword, and Music School, who had never revealed his strength, the number of land immortals in the Northern Mang pugilistic world could be counted on one hand. However, Liang Jianghu seemed to be lush and green. Among them, there were people who were no longer in the world, such as Wang Xianji, Hong Shixiang, Li Chungang, Chao Chongqing, Huang Sanjia, the father and son from Longhu Mountain who had ascended together, Zhao Huangchao, the monk of the dragon tree from the 2 Zen temples, Xianyuan Jingqing from Mount Hui, Gao Shulu, Lu Songtao, and so on. Not to mention, there was also the first sage of the Confucian school who lived in seclusion in Shangyin Academy, as well as the group of people who were still alive, such as Su Fengnian, the peach blossom sword god Dong Tai, Chen Jibao, the eunuch from Taiyan City who was the same age as Gua, the white-robed monk Li Dongxin, and Tantai Pingjing from the Guanyin sect. Moreover, Su Yanbing, Gu Jiantang, Xianyuan Qingfeng, Wu Jiancheng, and Xing Baishuang were only a step away from the Earth immortal realm. Although this was related to the fact that Beimang's Jianghu had never obtained the spring and autumn providence, it was still unreasonable for there to be such a great disparity between the top grade 1 grandmasters of both sides. In particular, the disparity in the number of Earth immortals was almost 2 hands apart, which was extremely strange. According to the deduction of Su Fengnian and the young leader of Wudong, Li Yufu, Beimang's Jianghu should not be so lifeless. In the past 20 years, there should be at least 4 to 6 more Earth immortals, 1 for each of the Confucian, Buddhist, and Taoist sections. There should be 1 or 2 Earth immortals among the pure martial artists. The possibility of someone successfully becoming an Earth Sword immortal was the highest. However, even if Su Fengnian and Tuoba Bodhisattva were fighting in the western region for thousands of miles, or killing the black dragon that symbolized Beimang's fate outside Liuzhou Pass, there were still no Earth immortals who appeared out of nowhere to stop them. It was as if someone in Beimang was deliberately suppressing the Jianghu's fate. But no matter what, where did the 3 or 4 Earth immortals who should have shone in Beimang in the past 20 years go? It was not that Su Fengnian did not know that Beimang was using Crown Prince Yelu Hongkai as bait to lure him to take the head of the general. In fact, Su Fengnian did not have much interest in killing Yelu Hongkai. If the old woman died of illness or a sudden death, then Yelu Hongcai's existence would not change Beimang's chaotic situation. On the contrary, it would worsen the internal strife. At the very least, his appearance would become a stumbling block in front of Yelu Hongkai and Yelu Dongchuang. If the Yelu family wanted to regain the glory of their ancestors, they would first have to engage in an internal strife before they could have the qualifications to unify the power of the imperial family and fight against the representative of the vassal towns, General Dongjua, the leader of the foreign relatives, Murong Baoding, and the other major powers of the grassland. Moreover, Yelu Hongkai had secretly probed Mount Qingliang through the famous princess of the grassland. Therefore, Su Fengnian did not bat an eyelid when faced with Yelu Hongcai's provocation. Su Fengnian was sure that there was a trap at his feet, which was why he dashed forward. Su Fengnian did not move forward in a straight line. Instead, he moved in an arc to where Deng Mao was blocking the way. The degree of danger of this trap was directly related to how highly the Crown Prince of Beimang was regarded by Su Fengnian. This also required Su Fengnian to weigh the pros and cons. In the end, the one Su Fengnian really wanted to kill was Tuoba Bodhisattva. The current Tuoba Bodhisattva had the invincible in the human realm that was close to the peak of Wang Xianji's martial arts. What did this mean? It meant that unless 2 martial arts grandmasters joined hands, they could barely stop the person Tuoba Bodhisattva wanted to kill. The reason why Su Fengnian did not go to Dunhuang and why Huyan Dagwan stopped him from rushing to Beimang was very simple. It was because of Tuoba Bodhisattva. Now, in the situation before Su Fengnian, there were 2 things that must be done. North rejecting city could not be lost. Even if Tuoba Bodhisattva was not killed, he could not continue to have that state. As for Yelu Hongkai and the others, they were not even worth mentioning. Chapter 2000. To lead those grandmasters of the Central Plains on a 1,000-mile raid to assassinate the old woman in Beimang, not to mention whether those grandmasters were willing to do so, in fact, it was absolutely impossible. On one hand, at that time, the principal of the chess and sword music school, Xiao Nian of the Princess Grave, Tai Mu Dyer, and a large group of Beimang grandmasters infiltrated the border of Yuzhou province, but they were all intercepted and killed. With Tuoba Bodhisattva's unblemished celestial being realm, the imposing manner of the 18 people gathered together was like a candle in a house in the dark night. Beimang could very well wait for the rabbit to come out of a tree stump and wait for the rabbit to come out of the tree stump. With Tuoba Bodhisattva leading a large group of Wu Dao grandmasters as the vanguard, they might not even be able to reach Shijing by then. Only Su Fengnian and Dong Tai would be able to retreat. More importantly, on the other hand, with 400,000 Beimang soldiers bearing down on the border and the loss of Beicheng, the Beiliang cavalry was like a rootless tree without a source. Beiliang had lost its last gate outside the border. Not only the 3 provinces of Beiliang, but also the entire northwestern border of the Central Plains was in a perilous situation. Even if Su Fengnian and those grandmasters managed to get through the heavy encirclement of Tuoba Bodhisattva and Beimang's iron cavalry, how could they accurately locate the old woman of Beimang who had chosen to hide her identity? One had to know that not only was she not an earth immortal, she was not even a first-stage martial artist. As a result, Su Fengnian was unable to determine her location based on the qi of a martial artist. On the other hand, the young king Su Fengnian had no way to retreat from North Jibei City, which must not be lost. Su Fengnian could not retreat. The remaining 17 grandmasters were unwilling to retreat. Only then did Su Fengnian and North Rejecting City win the current situation with great difficulty. In the Martial Emperor City, Huang Groom's building, Wei Miao of the Southern Zhao, and Chai Qingshan of the Eastern Yu Sword Pool. They risked their lives to stop the cavalry on the 2 wings of Beimang from shooting at the top of the city walls. Wu Luding and sword mate Suihua of the Wu family's sword tomb, as well as Su Yanbing behind them. Mao Shulang and Ji Lu, and of the Dragon Palace from the southern border, as well as Yu Xingrui, the Taoist master of the Wudang sect. These 2 groups of people defended their position to the death in order to delay the Beimang's besieging troops as much as possible. At the rear, Qing Baishuang and Shues Songguan were doing their best to stop the Beimang archers and the 2,000 catapults from attacking Beimang City. Beimang did not lack war horses or cavalry. They were known as the best cavalry archers in the world. They only lacked infantry that were good at sieges. The grandmasters of the Central Plains behind Su Fengnian and the white dress Luo Yang were actually doing the same thing, which was to exchange their lives for the greatest loss of the Beimang infantry. Obviously, Beimang was also aware of this, so they quickly mobilized Murong Baoding and Zhong Liang's private cavalry, as well as the elite cavalry and the spiderweb men of sacrifice, as well as the Beimang Jianghu forces that had decisively turned out in full force. They were using our entire Beimang Jianghu to exchange for your dozen people's Jianghu. If Beimang's Jianghu is still not enough, then we'll add in our grassland cavalry. Many Beimang officers and soldiers recognized the identity of the white dress, and they all had complicated feelings. After all, this grandmaster was known as the #1 devil path person in Beimang. In the Beimang court, where martial force was highly valued, everyone was happy to see him as a rebellious hero. However, Huyin Dagwan had never shown up, and this great devil, as a grandmaster of the Central Plains, had chosen to stand on the enemy's side. This made the nearby Beimang cavalry feel somewhat helpless, but they were not in a hurry to draw their swords against the infamous Luo Yang. Su Fengnian's hesitation before the battle and his failure to make a prompt decision to kill the Beimang crown prince made Deng Mao feel somewhat regretful. Deng Mao wanted to open his mouth and say to the young man, "Su Fengnian, you could have died more heroically." In Deng Mao's eyes, this kind of cautiousness that did not match the dual identities of a grandmaster of martial arts evaluation and the king of Beimang was just a chance to live a little longer in the world, or to make Li Mixi pay an extra price. Luo Yang had been quietly standing 200 steps behind Su Fengnian the whole time. In her vision, a young knight with a face full of armor suddenly appeared. He broke out from the Xia Shui army behind Yelu Hongkai and passed by the banner and the Beimang crown prince. He slowed down his horse's hooves and looked down at the young king Su Fengnian from above. He raised his arm and slowly took off his helmet. He had an ordinary appearance, but he had a pair of strange golden eyes. From the corners of Su Fengnian's eyes, he saw that following this young knight's sudden appearance, the circular clearing began to retreat like a tide. In the end, another 7 or 8 northern Mang cavalry were revealed, stopping their horses in place. Su Fengnian, who had been standing on the arc, instantly landed in a larger circular open space. The young knight with golden eyes said in a hoarse voice, "Su, we finally meet again." Su Fengnian asked with a smile, "A cut willow, Li Fengshuo?" The young knight pulled up the corners of his mouth and said with a sinister smile, "Good eyesight." In the hinterland of the Central Plains, this genius swordsman nicknamed A Cut Willow, together with Spider-Web's leader Old Moth and Beimang's relative Murong Longshui, chased after Miss Hehe. The other two successfully escaped. Only Li Fengshuo was cut in half at the waist by Su Fengnian, who was still His Royal Highness at the time. According to reason, he should have already died to the point where he couldn't be more dead. This young knight, who was rumored to be Li Mibi's illegitimate son, stared at the young king. Your Li Yang's Great Peace City has a great formation that is specially used to deal with Earth Immortals. Our Great Mang is a dynasty built on horseback. Since this is the case, I believe that you, Su Fengnian, have also realized that after you entered the Earth Immortal realm, Beimang had no choice but to create this seemingly unremarkable secret formation to deal with you. However, I am very curious. Why aren't you running? Are you waiting for death? Su Fengnian turned around to look at Luo Yang. The latter didn't hesitate at all and rushed away. A cut willow's phoenix head leaned forward slightly and shot a glance at the demon who had previously shaken the grassland. His eyes were full of regret, but soon he felt relieved. Leaving behind this young king who oversaw the Central Plains' northwest border, successfully pulling out this damned nail, could be considered as not wasting such a huge amount of effort. In an instant, a cut willow's figure disappeared from the horse's back. At the same time, those knights who didn't have any strange chi fluctuations at all, as if they were possessed by celestial beings, dazzling snow-white light shone from their 7 apertures and the iron armor on their bodies. In the next moment, Su Fengnian crossed his cold blade in front of him. Beimang's cut willow's phoenix head was actually holding the young king's war blade with one hand behind his back and the other hand's 5 fingers behind his back. Li Fengshuo, who was at most in the Finger Xian realm for the first time, revealed his strength at this moment, absolutely not inferior to an Earth Immortal. With Su Fengnian and Li Fengshuo as the center, 12 Beimang knights who were blooming with white flowing light had already abandoned their horses and stood in a big arc. One of them was standing right in front of Crown Prince Yelu Hongkai. 12 people, 12 celestial beings who had temporarily stepped into the Earth Immortal realm. 12 of them, at the same time, opened their arms, and the white light connected into a circle, like a snow-white flood dragon entrenched in the human world. Li Fengshuo's face was ferocious and proud. His 5 fingers that were holding the cold blade were surrounded by lightning, like an electric dragon swimming around. The young Beimang man's lips moved slightly and spat out 2 words, "Dead." Su Fengnian swept his blade and easily cut off Li Fengshuo's head. There was no blood spattering. The corpse fell to the ground like a shriveled skin bag. Then Su Fengnian looked up at the sky. In his vision, there was only a dazzling snow-white light. It was like a full moon falling into the human world. Outside the big circle, Li Fengshuo appeared beside Yelu Hongkai and Deng Mao. His eyes had returned to normal, but his whole body was covered in wounds. It was a horrible sight. However, this young man simply ignored the wounds on his body and his soul that had been broken together with his body. He only had joy in his eyes. Even if I have no future in martial arts in this life, it's worth it. The sun rose from the East Sea. The full moon fell on the human world. Within a day, outside the Liangzhou Pass, in less than half an hour, these 2 spectacular scenes were seen one after another. On the city wall of the North Barricade, countless Bailiang border guards could only watch the light column as thick as a mountain heavily hit the young king's head. Behind the Northern Mang Great Army, Yelu Dongchuan and Chun Ju Bo Tuoba stood side by side on the observation deck of a tower carriage. The former clicked his tongue in wonder and said, "So this is our emperor's trump card?" Tuoba Chiyun pressed his hands on the rough but sturdy railing and exhaled heavily. The young man, who had always been expressionless, suddenly raised his hands and patted the railing. He said in a carefree and loud voice, "Done." People didn't know that Chuanju Bo Fengyun was the one who had set up this big plan. Yelu Dongchuan suppressed the killing intent in his heart toward Tuoba Fengyun and asked curiously with a smile, "Chuanju Bo Fengyun, can you explain to me?" Tuoba Fengyun hesitated a little. Perhaps because he had personally created this great situation that could be said to have saved half of the country, even Tuoba Fengyun couldn't help but feel a little proud. He looked at the majestic light column that had not shown any signs of decline and said with a smile, "Presumably, you also know that there were several banished immortals that fell one after another in the border areas of the Southern Dynasty, right?" Yelu Dongchuan nodded and secretly looked at the side face of his peer from the corner of his eyes. His high-spirited spirit that was even better than that of the scholars in the Central Plains really made people envious and jealous of him. Tuoba Fengyun's eyes were only focused on the magnificent battlefield of heaven and man in the distance. He continued to talk about his strategy. Those were just icing on the cake. In fact, even if there weren't several celestial beings that were knocked down to the human world by Su Fengnian, Beimang's Jianghu fate was enough to accumulate 4 or 5 celestial beings. Tuoba Fengyun, started to advise the emperor on this matter in the chess and sword music school when I was 20 years old. Chapter 2001. At this point, Tuoba Chiyun's lips curled up. She paused for a moment and turned to look at Yelu Dongchuan, who had an uncertain expression. She asked with a smile, "Do you know why there are no more than 3 land immortals in such a big grassland? Why did Huyen Daguan, who is a sect by himself, go to the Central Plains? Why did the woman in white, who stopped the number 1 person in diabolism, only send out a cavalry but not a real top martial arts master? And why did the Chilan immortal, who is a national advisor, choose to leave the human world before the first battle of Liangmang without any warning?" Yelu Dongchuan could not answer a single one of the questions. Tuoba Chiyun laughed and said, "Isn't it strange that the master of Bubang Mountain, the 5th raccoon, was only at the Fingers Xian realm before he died? If it is said that the Chilan sect's fate was taken away by Yuan Qingshan alone, causing the other Taoist experts to stagnate in their realms, it is still reasonable. Then why is it that my chess, sword and music house, which has produced so many heroes, is still unable to break through that layer of window paper? In the end, it's just a simple logic. Since Huang Sanjia of the Central Plains scattered the fate of the fallen countries into Jianghu, then why can't my grassland merge the fate of Jianghu with the dynasty? It's nothing if the martial arts of Jianghu are used by the imperial court. Only when the fate of Jianghu is used by the dynasty can it be considered safe. Whether it's the Su family riding their horses in Jianghu or the grassland gathering of Jianghu sects in the early days, it's all a simple plan. It can't be considered as cutting the weeds and eliminating the roots." Tuoba Chiyun seemed to have realized that she had lost her composure. She quickly stopped smiling and returned to her calm state of mind. She no longer revealed the secrets of heaven. You only need to know that in order to suppress Su Fengnian, the emperor paid an immeasurable price. Therefore, the king of Bailiang died a worthy death. Yelu Dongchuan rubbed his chin. He did not care whether the king of Bailiang died a worthy death or not. He only knew that the shrewd young man beside him was definitely not to be attracted. One day, he would let Tuoba Chiyun die a worthy death. Suddenly, Tuoba Chiyun's eyes widened and she was shocked. Yelu Dongchuan followed his line of sight and his emotions surged. There was fear, respect, and the fascination of a martial artist. For some reason, Yelu Dongwen felt a sense of unspeakable satisfaction. What great things can a scholar achieve in this chaotic world? The pillar of light that symbolized the way of heaven pressed down rapidly. It was so fast that even the young vassal king, one of the 4 grandmasters of Wu Ping, could not escape from the cage created by the joint efforts of the celestial beings, the insurmountable thunder pool. 12 Beimang land immortals appeared together. 3 of them were banished immortals who had been personally struck down from the sky by Su Fengnian. Before their bodies and spirit were about to completely merge into the light pillar, one of them sneered and said, "How dare a mere mortal disobey the will of heaven? Do you really think that we will be so weak?" The Baimang land immortals who stood behind the young vassal king had the most powerful momentum, as if they were guarding the four directions of heaven and earth. These four celestial beings were different from the Baimang Qi cultivators who bore the fate of Jianghu with the body of a mortal and temporarily entered the realm of land immortals. These four celestial beings came from heaven and were the same as Bodhisattva Tuoba's cultivation. They were also one of the gifts from the will of heaven. However, they were relatively more hidden and were far less dignified than Bodhisattva Tuoba who bore the will of heaven. The burly figure standing in front of the young king opened his mouth and spoke like a great bell. He looked at the pitiful figure who was almost kneeling on the ground because of the way of heaven, and said without the slightest emotion, "Su Fengnian, why are you still resisting?" At this moment, whether it was the central plains of Liang or the grassland of Baimang, almost everyone looked up and could see the snow-white waterfall that seemed to fall from heaven. However, in the eyes of most people, it was more like a slender fishing line. When the immortals were fishing, the clouds were on the shore and the human world was in the water. In the light beam, Su Fengnian knelt on one knee and held the cold blade with his left hand. The tip of the blade was pressed against the ground and did not pierce into the ground at all. The vassal king's robe was not damaged at all. It only caused some ripples when the young vassal king's body trembled. Su Fengnian's perception was cut off. Not only was he deaf, mute, and blind, but he also lost his divine will. The body of a celestial being could not resist the way of heaven's light beam at all. Although it was not completely shattered, it was already showing signs of collapsing. Su Fengnian, who was kneeling on one knee, lowered his head and his arm holding the blade was trembling non-stop. From his 7 apertures, including the one between his eyebrows, 8 streams of qi flowed out of his body, like 7 little snow-white snakes slithering in the air. Su Fengnian, who had lost all his senses, subconsciously propped himself up with his saber and pressed his right palm against the ground. He subconsciously propped himself up and tried his best to stand up. It was as if he was carrying a burden and continued to walk with it. The celestial being behind Su Fengnian sneered and said, "Our grassland cavalry broke through the pass and went south to unify the central plains for the first time. This is an established trend. How dare you, Su Fengnian, try to stop the will of heaven by yourself? You're overestimating yourself." The celestial being on Su Fengnian's left crossed his arms and laughed. "I can already see the eagle from the grassland perched on the eaves of the Central Plains Library." The celestial being on Su Fengnian's right shook his head slightly. His silver eyes showed some sarcasm and pity. "With only the power of one place, you can show a power that is more impressive than the power of a country. You've caused so much trouble for our grassland men. You Bailiang are not bad." Chapter 2002. Compared to the northern Mang's secret qi cultivators who had already dissipated in the pillars of light, the figures of the 4 celestials and 3 exiled immortals were much more durable. They seemed to be a little impatient with the young lord's persistence. After looking at each other, the 3 banished immortals nodded and dispersed their bodies and spirits. In this way, the light beam that was already aggressive suddenly became more powerful. The young lord who was kneeling on one knee suddenly felt his shoulders sink a little. Tuoba Chi Yun, who was sweating profusely, felt relieved. But this time, he couldn't smile anymore and still looked serious. Yelu Dongchuang, who had been looking at Chun Jubo's face, was a little disappointed. He thought that Su Fengnian could at least risk his life to exchange for those immortals from Earth. It would be even better if he could kill Yelu Hongkai in one go. At some point in time, a purple robe rose from the ground in the distance and crashed into the pillar of light. Luo Yang in white tipped her toes and grabbed Xianyuan Qingfeng's shoulder, smashing her to the ground. She said in a low voice, "Don't go. With your fate, you can dominate the Jianghu. But against the fate of heaven, it's like hitting a stone with an egg. You'll die in vain." After killing more than 80 Baimang Jianghu experts and piercing through the encirclement of 1,000 cavalry, Xianyuan Qingfeng was obviously badly injured. After falling to the ground, she spat out a mouthful of blood. She ignored Luo Yang's warning. The qi in her body was circulating rapidly and she was about to stand up again. Luo Yang quickly landed beside her and said calmly, "Trust me." Xianyuan Qinfeng gave up attacking the light beam and said coldly, "Don't do things more than 3 times. Now, don't stop me from killing that Beimang crown prince." Luo Yang didn't have any intention to stop her this time. She just smiled angrily and said, "You really know how to take advantage of the situation." However, Deng Mao with the broken spear had already bypassed the light beam and appeared in front of the 2 women, blocking the way of the purple dress of Mount Wishan. On the city wall of North Barricade, a drum sound that was heavier and more solemn than the previous drums sounded heavily. Luo Yang also laughed out loud and said, "The winds of Great Qin rise." In the pillar of light, the young man who carried the heavenly axiom on his shoulders seemed to have heard the sound of drums and Qin Empress's words. There was a woman in white who shouted with a sobbing tone after beating the drum, "You're not allowed to die." However, just as the saying goes, Taoist is 1 foot tall, while the devil is 10 feet tall, the 4 immortals who were enforcing justice on behalf of the heavens also began to take a step forward, taking the initiative to merge into the pillar of light. Every time each figure took a step forward, the pillar of light would increase in momentum. In the light beam, the cold blade in the young man's right hand was gradually crumbling. His lips moved slightly, but no words came out of the light beam. Even he couldn't hear his own voice. But the young king knew what he was talking about. On that snowy night outside Liangzhou Pass, an old man asked his eldest son, who was temporarily acting as a groom, if he could take on the responsibility. The young man nodded. At this moment, Su Fengnian slowly straightened his back, inch by inch. The words he said to himself before were, "Su Shao, I will definitely do what I promised you. Even if I can't take on the responsibility, I still have to." Every time the immortals took a step forward, every time the pillar of light increased in momentum, even if the young man's body swayed several times, he still stood up in the end. When Su Fengnian finally carried the heavenly axiom on his shoulders and straightened his back, the last remaining immortal stretched out his arm. He didn't dissipate between heaven and earth, but held a dazzling spear and slowly walked towards Su Fengnian. Deng Mao began to charge forward toward Xianyuan Qinfeng. Luo Yang suddenly turned around and moved several meters to the side, crossing her arms in front of her to block the impact of a burly figure. The peach blossom sword god Dong Tai held the Taya sword in his hand and arrived in an instant, sweeping toward the thick pillar of light with his sword horizontally. This sword could be called the pinnacle of the human world. After the burly man punched Luo Yang back, he didn't pursue or block Dong Tai's sword. He said coldly, "It's too late." The pillar of light suddenly disappeared. However, Su Fengnian was also stabbed in the chest by the immortal holding the snow-white spear. The young lord didn't bleed. After the snow-white spear pierced through his body, it revealed an exceptionally dazzling snow-white light. At this moment, it was as if all sounds between heaven and earth were silent. The first to break the silence was Luo Yang. She turned around and glared at the back of the figure, questioning, "Why?" In a trance, there seemed to be 2 Luo Yang in white. One was a real body, and the other was an ethereal spirit. The 2 constantly overlapped and separated. It turned out that she had planned to use her spirit to escape from her body. The former was to block Tuoba Bodhisattva's attack while the latter was to block Su Fengnian's attack. She had indeed done so, but she was stopped by Su Fengnian. The young lord with his head lowered raised his arm and held the spear. He said in a hoarse voice, "Women, don't meddle in men's business." The immortal's figure finally dissipated and turned into ashes. He looked at Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was expressionless and just nodded gently. The immortal then disappeared with a smile. Su Fengnian twisted his wrist and broke the spear. He slowly turned around and looked directly at Tuoba Bodhisattva. Tuoba Bodhisattva glanced at Dong Tai, and then asked the young lord with a smile, "Is the 2 of them enough? If it's not enough, add the 2 of them. I can ask Deng Mao to step down." Su Fengnian smiled and said to Dong Tai, "Take them away from here." Dong Tai frowned. Su Fengnian's eyes were firm. The peach blossom sword god could only say, "Don't worry." Su Fengnian shook his sleeves and said to the Beimang military god, Tuoba Bodhisattva, although I don't know your parents. Then Su Fengnian said the second sentence. But I will beat you until your parents don't recognize you. It seemed that before the voice dissipated, Su Fengnian and Tuoba Bodhisattva's figures had already disappeared. The battle between the two was the peak of the millennium. Chapter 2003. After Su Fengnian and Tuoba Bodhisattva disappeared, Deng Mao felt a little embarrassed. After all, the three people in front of him, Dong Tai, Luo Yang, and Xianyuan Qingfeng, were Wu Dao grandmasters who were deeply involved in the Beimang army. Any one of them was enough to make him suffer, especially the peach blossom sword god who had shown his talent in this battle. Deng Mao probably had to suffer more than one jar. Deng Mao was never known for his talent in martial arts. Instead, he was more like a diligent old farmer. Every time he plowed a piece of land, his harvest was earned through hard work. Of course, Deng Mao's so-called ordinary foundation was only compared to those young people who had shown extraordinary talent in Jianghu. For example, Xianyuan Qingfeng, the owner of the Moonless Tower and the Great Snow Plateau, who had occupied 3 of the 13 chiefs of Auspicious Talisman, was now known as the Twin Jade Annals of Jianghu along with the young vassal king. She was so talented and blessed that she was almost not inferior to Su Fengnian, who was already standing at the top of the world. When Su Fengnian asked the Peach Blossom Sword God to escort the 2 women out of the battlefield, Luo Yang was worried, but she did not look reluctant. She was ready to leave with Dong Tai because she knew very well that with the cultivation of Su Fengnian and Tuoba Bodhisattva, only Dong Tai and Huyen Dagwan among the millions of martial artists in the world could intervene. Other than them, it was no different from a fool's dream if anyone wanted to help or take advantage of the situation. It could even be said that it was useless to say that even the immortals on earth would be useless. If Luo Yang really wanted to help Su Fengnian, she would leave as far as possible. Otherwise, she would only become a weakness that Tuoba Bodhisattva could use against Su Fengnian. Only Xianyuan Qingfeng looked past the dignified Deng Mao and stared at the Beimang banner. She was ready to make a move, as if she did not care whether she would be affected by the battle at the peak of the Beimang army. In this woman's heart, liking someone was very important, but whether the person she liked her or not was not important. In her eyes, there was probably never just a single person's back. In her eyes, there was the heavy snow on the snowfield, the ebb and flow of the Jianghu, the bright moon above the sea, and many people, many things, and many sights. Deng Mao was able to achieve what he had today because of his tenacity. Therefore, this Beimang grandmaster, who was almost at death's door, was fearless even if he had to fight against 3 people alone. His battle intent surged, and he advanced instead of retreating. Deng Mao held the broken spear tightly, his clothes fluttering. He faced the purple-robed man of the Central Plains and asked in a deep voice, "Are you Xianyuan Qingfeng of the Great Snow Plains?" Xianyuan Qingfeng retracted his gaze and sneered, "Could it be your long-lost mother?" Deng Mao, who had already disregarded life and death, was stunned and speechless for a moment. Clearly, he didn't expect that Xianyuan Qingfeng, a grandmaster of the Jianghu, would say such unbearable words. Not far away, Luo Yang shook her head slightly and clicked her tongue. She really needs to change her temper. It's too unlikable. For some reason, Luo Yang had always held a subtle admiration for this arrogant and despotic chief of the Liang Wulin alliance. Hearing this, the Peach Blossom Sword God smiled and teased, which was rare of him. The Central Plains, on the other hand, are fond of this. Nowadays, masters roam the Jianghu, hiding and hiding. It's very undesirable. Luo Yang couldn't help but laugh. She remembered something and asked in a low voice, "Why did the heavenly way that fell to the mortal world disappear on its own? Was it because you cut it off?" Dong Tai shook his head and said, "In fact, my sword didn't hit the light beam just now. As for why it suddenly disappeared, I'm not sure if it was to avoid my Taya sword's edge, or if it was to hide something and have a backup plan." Luo Yang looked up at the sky and said angrily, "It's so annoying. It's like a ghost that won't go away." Dong Tai agreed. He turned his head and looked at the top of North Barricade City. He said to Xianyuan Qingfeng solemnly, "The Beimang army is about to reach the city." You two better go back to support them so that Su Fengnian won't be distracted. As for me, I have to go to the sky and take a look. Xianyuan Qingfeng said expressionlessly, since we're already here, there's no reason to turn around and leave. You don't have to worry about me. I, Xianyuan Qingfeng, am in charge of my own life. Dong Tai smiled and dismissed it. Then, he chanted the word rise and stepped on the Taiya sword. He rose into the sky and broke through the clouds. One man and one sword disappeared into the golden sea of clouds above everyone's heads. If Su Fengnian's enemy was the invincible Tuoba Bodhisattva and was no longer suitable for Dong Tai to interfere, then the only person who could be considered a mortal enemy by the Peach Blossom Sword God would be in the sky. Luo Yang said hello to the back of Mount Huishan Ze. Then, she smiled and said, Xianyuan Qingfeng, I'll give you my deer chasing mountain as your dowry. Anyway, I don't think you'll be able to get married in this lifetime. Xianyuan Qingfeng didn't turn around, but his shoulders were obviously stiff. Luo Yang in white flew up and left with a laugh, returning to North Barricade City. It wasn't that the Beimang army was scared out of their wits and could only allow the former #1 demonic cultivator of Beimang to come and go as she pleased. It was because the battlefield behind Luo Yang was already in chaos. Countless Beimang soldiers were frantically fleeing, and no one could pay attention to her movements. It turned out that back then, the Northern Mang war god was kicked out by the new King Liang. Even though his tall and sturdy figure didn't fall to the ground, he still slid several dozen zhang away. The 100 or so armored Northern Mang cavalry on that path were instantly sent flying to the sides by Tuoba Bodhisattva's retreating body. Both men and horses were sent flying into the air, causing many innocent cavalry soldiers to fall off their horses as well. Su Fengnian didn't follow up with another attack. After landing on the ground, he put his saber back into its sheath. After the dust settled, Tuoba Bodhisattva stood where he was. Although he had been knocked back by Su Fengnian, he didn't look embarrassed at all. This Beimang war god, who had always been crowned as the king of the grassland, had arms like an ape. Strands of golden qi that were almost condensing into solid objects circled around his body. Especially under the light of the rising sun, they shone brightly, as if he was a war god from the heavens. His aura was majestic and unparalleled. He could destroy mountains and shake cities, and thousands of soldiers would flee. The tens of thousands of Beimang soldiers at the center of the battlefield were first shocked when they saw this scene. Then, they drew their sabers and roared at the same time. Tuoba Bodhisattva closed his eyes and raised his chin slightly. His entire body was bathed in the sunlight, as if he was intoxicated by the vitality of the world. Su Fengnian took a deep breath. His sleeves fluttered and were instantly filled with the Great Spirit. He took a step forward with his left foot. There was a loud bang under his foot. Cracks appeared and spread in all directions, forming a huge spider web. The next moment, Su Fengnian's figure appeared in front of Tuoba Bodhisattva. He jumped up high and stretched out his right fist in a big arc, quickly smashing towards Tuoba Bodhisattva's forehead. For some reason, Tuoba Bodhisattva didn't move at all. He maintained his original posture and didn't move at all. Su Fengnian's fist smashed down and directly smashed Tuoba Bodhisattva's body. In an instant, he disappeared from everyone's sight. Su Fengnian stood at the edge of the big pit. He looked down and frowned. Tuoba Bodhisattva stood at the bottom of the pit and slowly opened his eyes. He looked at Su Fengnian, who had just punched with the power of thunder. Tuoba Bodhisattva's mouth twitched, full of sarcasm and disdain. At the same time, he seemed to be asking why the young king was so polite, and why he didn't use the more lethal two-sleeved green snake at the beginning. This kind of attack didn't hurt at all. Was it because Su Fengnian had become too weak, or was it because I, Tuoba Bodhisattva, had become too strong? Su Fengnian's brows relaxed. He gently twisted his wrist and then suddenly clenched his fists. This time, Su Fengnian disappeared in a flash. Probably because his speed was too fast, the place where he originally stood exploded into a cloud of mist. Su Fengnian, who was wearing a purple gold embroidered robe, rushed forward. Wherever his body passed, a long black rainbow stretched out. No one on the battlefield clearly saw how the young king attacked. They could only vaguely see that Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was covered in golden light, was hit by the black rainbow. His whole body flew backward again and again. The black rainbow followed like a shadow. It was as if Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was shrouded in golden dragons, was hit again and again. In this straight line, more than 100 Baimang cavalrymen who couldn't dodge in time were torn into pieces on the spot. If they were hit directly, they would be smashed into pieces. Every time the two grandmasters collided, the violent sound caused by the collision came late and seemed to be extremely delayed. Every punch landed squarely on the body. There were no flashy moves, nor were there any magnificent and shocking ultimate techniques. On the contrary, it was like a rude and unreasonable fight between villagers. They went back and forth, and it was very straightforward. However, it was purely because the two sides were Su Fengnian and Tuoba Bodhisattva. It was a Vajra realm against a Vajra realm. With Su Fengnian's current chi dynamic and physique, he could fly at the speed of his sword. However, every time he rushed forward to kill Tuoba Bodhisattva, he would take a step that seemed cumbersome but was actually very mysterious. This was not the Taoist magic of shrinking the ground into an inch, but it was taken from the Grand Peace City's gatekeeper, Master Lu Haosher. At that time, Master Lu Haosher used this move to enter the city from 10 miles away. The starting distance was an inch that an ordinary child could cross in one step. The last step was as long as 1,000 feet. The key was that during this period, he could continuously accumulate his power. It was similar to the stacking and stopping that White Fox's face used to scare Tuoba Bodhisattva away. White Fox's face once said that 12 stops could kill a celestial state. Below 16 stops, the celestial's physique was like a piece of white paper. After 18 stops, there would be no land immortals in front of him. Compared to Gu Jiantang, who climbed the Wudang mountain to challenge the Buddhist Vajrali Dangshin, White Fox's face once said that 12 stops could kill a celestial state. Below 16 stops, the celestial's physique was like a piece of white paper. After 18 stops, there would be no land immortals in front of him. Compared to Gu Jiantang, who climbed Wudang mountain to challenge the Buddhist Vajrali Dangshin of Buddhism, Vajrali Dangshin. The battle between masters was fought at the millimeter. Therefore, this step that seemed to slow down the speed was the essence of Su Fengnian's real advantage. As for the four great grandmasters of Wushu evaluation, Su Fengnian was beating Tuoba Bodhisattva from the beginning to the end. Tuoba Bodhisattva could only parry and did not have the strength to fight back. When the high and mighty immortals fought, the ant-like mortals could not hope to sit on a bench and watch the show, not to mention clapping and cheering on the ground or pointing out the world with relish. Chapter 2004. From Qi Xuanzhen's ascension on the demon-slaying platform to Su Fengnian's battle with the immortal of Dragon Tiger Mountain in the capital city's imperial astronomer, countless bloody Jianghu grasslands had already proved this point. In addition to drawing their swords to boost Tuoba Bodhisattva's momentum, Baimang's cavalry had already deliberately retreated to the east and west under the urgent mobilization of some generals and kiliarchs. They did not care about the established formation to prevent themselves from being implicated in the battle between the two grandmasters. It was a pity that the young king who had been suppressed by the heavenly way did not show any signs of weakening. His attacks were still shocking and Tuoba Bodhisattva inexplicably fell into a dangerous situation where he was beaten passively, causing the thousands of cavalry nearby to die in the hands of their own war god. A Baimang cavalryman who was galloping to the west only felt that he was lifted off the ground and turned around. It turned out that Tuoba Bodhisattva's tall back had hit him near the horse's buttocks. Fortunately, Tuoba Bodhisattva only smashed the back half of the warhorse's body and the cavalryman was not killed on the spot. However, the young king who was following behind quickly grabbed his head and threw him out. The cavalryman in armor was thrown to Tuoba Bodhisattva who had just slowed down. The latter stretched out an arm forward. The poor cavalryman crashed into the majestic Qi and shattered like an egg hitting a rock. Su Fengnian passed through the bloody mist and pressed a palm on Tuoba Bodhisattva's chest. In the past, on the reed-filled path outside Xiangfan City, Bailiang His Royal Highness had used a move that he had comprehended from practicing his swordsmanship to defeat the red armor talisman general who was far superior to him. That move was named armor removal. This was the first time Su Fengnian used the fixed move in a battle of life and death between the two grandmasters. Logically speaking, Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was supposed to retreat faster than before, did not retreat at all at this moment, which was extremely unusual. The golden chi as thick as an arm wandered freely like dragons, like the eyes of a heavenly king, solemn and dignified. 18 strands of vital energy lingered in the surroundings like 18 coiling flood dragons. After resisting the young king's armor removal, the golden dragons wandered and rolled faster. It was dazzling and made Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was already tall and sturdy, look even more majestic and awe-inspiring. Returning to nature, the chi was as usual. This was the chi that only celestial state warriors or Taoist Xianzhenren could possess. It was the dream of all martial artists in the world. The second-grade master or first-grade Vajra state. When they occasionally showed up in Jianghu, they were often the most sensational because their chi was much more than ordinary martial artists. They were often the most outstanding when they appeared Jianghu. Their chi was realm level was realm. They would often cause a sensation when they occasionally in Jianghu, because they were in chi that was much realm, they was, and the chi and had seen King, the great lord, north, many head, many who had many times and went alone, many alone north city. Of the many had master. Tuoba Bodhisattva was another special case after Wang Xianji of the martial emperor city. He was a special case among the earth immortals. This Beimang army god's chi was so strong that he had to pour it out. Tuoba Bodhisattva's eyes were full of sarcasm. He seemed to be looking down on the young king's insignificant skill. Su Fengnian changed his palm into 2 fingers and formed a sword. Finger sword style. On the big lake outside Yuyan Mountain Villa, there was once a female chi cultivator from the Guanyin sect who fought Su Fengnian with 2 styles of finger Xian realm. One was finger mountain and the other was finger sea. They respectively meant finger mountain to fill the sea and finger sea to destroy the mountain. Tuoba Bodhisattva also felt the chi movement in his chest. After weighing the pros and cons, he turned sideways in the blink of an eye and dodged the young king's finger. As expected, when Bodhisattva Tuoba barely dodged the finger sword, a white rainbow of sword aura shot out. The power of the sword aura was not inferior to the all-out sword strike of a land sword immortal at close range. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva soon showed a somewhat helpless expression. The seemingly aggressive mountain-splitting sword style was suddenly weakened after shooting out for a short distance. At the same time, the young king's 2 fingers turned back into a palm and the back of his hand was placed on Tuoba Bodhisattva's chest. He slapped his arm. Stacked thunder. Tuoba Bodhisattva's chest felt like it was struck by lightning. However, he only gently inhaled and the 18 golden dragons suddenly stopped. Then, the power of the stacked thunder was miraculously removed. The stacked thunder that was on the verge of being triggered had a total of 6 times. It was continuous and progressive. After Tuoba Bodhisattva inhaled and exhaled, the dragons returned to their swimming state. A human's breath was very ordinary. Tuoba Bodhisattva's understatement of movement and stillness made the young king's terrifying stacked thunder disappear after the second stacking. Su Fengnian's left hand, which was hidden in his big sleeve, clenched his fist and loosened his 5 fingers. It was also an extremely simple action. After that, Tuoba Bodhisattva's head shook violently as if it was hit by a bell. Then, his whole body flew out horizontally. Gu Jintang's thunder square was known as the thunder pool of palms. Tuoba Bodhisattva's body staggered horizontally. He stepped heavily on the ground and forcibly stopped his body. Beimang's god of war raised his arm and gently wiped the blood from his nose with his thumb. Golden blood. The former leader of Buddhism in the world, the dragon tree monk of the 2 Zen temples who met Su Fengnian in Beimang, relied on his supreme cultivation to cast an invincible Vajra body. The blood in his body was refined into golden liquid. 800 years ago, the group of great Qin alchemists who tirelessly went to the sea to search for the immortality elixir for the emperor was actually a kind of zhong shentong in the hearts of the people of the future. Undoubtedly, turning stone into gold was the most fascinating thing. Although this was the short-sightedness of the common people, in fact, after the great Qin dynasty, there were many branches of Taoism such as the Pill Cauldron Talisman Amulet. Of course, the Pill Cauldron sect had a deeper meaning. The Pill Cauldron sect mainly focused on the internal and external Jindan. Even the Talisman Amulet sect had to advocate refining Jindan internally and using talisman amulets externally. Wudong's patriarch Lu was the master of Taoism's inner elixir study. Wudong's Grand Yellow Hall and Jade Emperor Pavilion of Dragon Tiger Mountain were two qi cultivation techniques. The former was regarded as having the magical effect of, once the apertures are enlightened, the golden body. Therefore, Taoism's Midas gold was only one step away from Buddhists' invincible golden body. Chapter 2005. Tuoba Bodhisattva looked around. He was curious as to why the young enemy did not continue to suppress him. Could it be that he had realized that it was a fool's dream to completely destroy his chi in one go? Or was he secretly accumulating his power, the real trump card, similar to the 18 stops that the white fox face forced him to retreat? No matter what the young king thought, Tuoba Bodhisattva did not care. The realm of martial arts, the physique of a martial artist, and the state of mind of martial arts. A tripartite balance. Generally speaking, it was the external physique and the internal state of mind that supported the realm together. Tuoba Bodhisattva was originally very conceited about his physique. It was the same as pure martial artists like Liang Shenyuan Great Disc. The physique was the real foundation. After the battle with Dong Tai, his state of mind was close to perfection and reached the peak. However, after the battle with Su Fengnian in the 1,000 Miles West region, he fell into a situation where his life was hanging by a thread. In the Battle of the Dragon Eye Plain, he was forced to retreat by the White Fox face with an unprecedented 18 stops. It was one disaster after another. Therefore, even if his physique was far better than before, and his realm was high, he was confident that he had won against the other three grandmasters. Although it was a realm of excessive enthusiasm, there was no hidden danger. Then, the only regret, but not the flaw, was his state of mind. The subtlety of the state of mind was that every level had a small perfection of each level. A second-grade master could also achieve a flawless state of mind. For example, Mount Huishan Shenyuan Great Disc and the current Liang Shuolu Spear Saint Li Hongho were respected as masters in Jianghu. It was recognized that they had great martial arts but little martial virtues. However, in the same realm, these two were undoubtedly the closest to being invincible. The people of the three sects who could enter the first-grade realm mostly had a good state of mind. However, they often had an empty realm, but their combat power was not as good as the pure martial artists in the realm who cultivated their strength and not their mind. The unpredictability of the state of mind was due to the profound difference. Wang Xianji, who had dominated Jianghu for 60 years, claimed to be one of the top 10 martial artists. He could fight against 9 people and was absolutely invincible. This was the state of mind of Wang Xianji that stood above everyone. It made people feel that this God above old man should have ascended early. Why did he bully people in the mortal world? Tuoba Bodhisattva wanted to know how the young king who disappeared had achieved such a state of mind. Therefore, he did not fight. He wanted to let Su Fengnian use his life's unique skill. He wanted to use Su Fengnian as the world's best whetstone to sharpen his state of mind. He wanted to let Su Fengnian to show his skills to use Su Fengnian as the world's best sharpening his state. Tuoba Bodhisattva for the first time to speak. To Su Fengnian. Han war atva atto to his to fight. Was to tuto him to warm him to him, to him to face. Su, tuto him. Finally, Su Fengnian showed his true form. Hovering in the sky, he lowered his head and replied, "Call you Lord?" Tuoba Bodhisattva looked up and sneered, "Is the great king of Baoyang all you can do is talk?" Su Fengnian smiled and squinted his eyes, looking up at the North Rejection City in the south. Here it comes. Dark clouds loomed over the city. In the world, Li Chungang was the most powerful sword user, and Su Fengnian was the second most powerful one. The dense and majestic sword rain was the sword tombs scattered all over Yuzhou and River Province after the battle between the Wudong Mountain and the Zhang family. Although many of them were lost during the battle, there were still thousands of them. There were also more than 6,000 ordinary iron swords collected from Bailiang's Huainan and Huainan's Jianghu by the Fish Dragon Gang. In that instant, Northern Mang's three 10,000-man siege infantry formations all raised their heads to shoot a glance at the same time. They couldn't help but swallow their saliva. Nearly 8,000 flying swords came from the east to the west. Then, like an arc of iron cavalry, they flew from the south to the north in the sky above the North Rejection City, quickly sweeping past this majestic border city. In the end, the tips of the swords all pointed at the Beimang army outside the North Rejection City. No matter how heavy the rain was, no one had ever heard of anyone dying in the rain. But what if knives fell from the sky and flying swords fell from the sky? Tuoba Bodhisattva said in a low voice, "You dare to divert your attention and control the swords? Su Fengnian, you're really courting death." Su Fengnian pressed his hand down heavily. 8,000 falling swords. One sleeve of green snakes, and sword energy like green dragons, rushed toward Tuoba Bodhisattva on the ground. Tuoba Bodhisattva stomped on the ground, and thunder rumbled on the ground. His body rose from the ground, and one of the golden flood dragons rushed toward Su Fengnian first. Su Fengnian's 18 sleeves of green snake sword energy, one sleeve after another. Below the North Rejection City, although almost all the Beimang infantry raised their shields and tried their best to block the rain of arrows, the flying swords that fell with the momentum of wind and thunder still penetrated the Beimang heavy shields, armor, and bodies, nailing more than 3,000 Beimang infantry outside the North Rejection City on the spot. More than 2,000 Beimang barbarians who were relatively lucky had their shoulders cut off, thighs pierced, or feet pierced. Although their lives were not in danger, their combat strength was severely damaged. The three infantry formations that had pushed 50 steps below the city wall with great difficulty were instantly defeated. From the beginning to the end, not a single arrow fell from the North Rejection City wall. Half of the 8,000 swords were broken, but there were still 4,000 swords that were intact and stabbed into the ground at an angle. It was like a sword formation with a solemn aura, blocking between the North Rejection City and the Beimang army. Such a large-scale sword defense that consumed an infinite amount of chi was bound to have to pay a huge price when facing a martial arts evaluation grandmaster like Tuoba Bodhisattva. First, it was the powerful 8,000 swords and the 18 sleeves of green snake sword. It was up against Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was ready and had 18 flood dragons protecting him. As expected, the young lord's 18 swords were shattered by the golden flood dragons. Although Su Fengnian's immortal's touch on the top still managed to hit Tuoba Bodhisattva's head, he was also punched in the stomach by the latter. Tuoba Bodhisattva's body swayed as he went against the flow. Step by step, he ascended to the sky and punched Su Fengnian's arms that were blocking in front of him. The last punch even broke through Su Fengnian's arms and smashed on his face. The young lord's body instantly disappeared into a sea of clouds as if he had ascended in broad daylight. Tuoba Bodhisattva hovered in the air, 300 feet above the ground. Heavens above. Chapter 2006. The two generals on the left and right flanks of Beimang, each with 5,000 cavalry, almost went crazy. They were able to participate in the siege as cavalry and obtain this kind of easy merit. Although the merit was not destined to be great, it was easy to win. They did not have to risk their lives like the first group of 30,000 infantry to push to the bottom of the city wall and then risk their lives to besiege the city. As the two flanks of cavalry, in fact, they were just shooting a few rounds on horseback symbolically, trying their best to help the elite infantry of the Southern Dynasty suppress the rain of arrows on the city wall. In addition, Beimang itself had crossbows and more than 2,000 catapults as the main projectile force, so the two cavalry forces did not have to bear any responsibility at all. The Bailiang cavalry had long figured out a pattern. Whether the Beimang barbarians' border army was the old army, the children's army, or the sun's army, one just had to look at the status of their general. Generals from Norland who were stationed at the border of the Southern Dynasty were usually not too bad, but also definitely not too high. Therefore, the soldiers and horses under their command were usually in the upper middle, and the majority of them were the children's army. First, the nobles of Norland and the great Devi did not care about the western capital's imperial court. In the eyes of these arrogant people of the grassland, there were probably not many people who could be considered as officials other than Huang Songpu, Dong Zhuo, and Lu Gui, who were great generals and officials. Furthermore, His Majesty had always carried out the strategy of the remnants of the spring and autumn period and the nobles of Longguan jointly ruling the southern dynasty, and did not support the important people of Norland getting involved in the southern dynasty. As for the local generals of the southern dynasty, it was generally based on the status of their family. The descendants of the Longguan nobles were the most valuable. For example, Wanyan Yinjiang, who had personally rushed to the battlefield at Laolu Mountain in Liuzhou, and his elite cavalry was the old army of the southern dynasty. Whether it was in terms of combat strength or equipment, they were second to none. Then there were the Jia and Yi families outside of the Longguan nobles. They were also deeply rooted in the southern dynasty's military and politics, and were often very familiar with the main field cavalry forces of Bailiang. They could not be underestimated. These two cavalry troops were typical of the southern dynasty's border army. Their ancestors had already secretly relied on their connections to pull strings. It wasn't easy for them to rely on the crown prince, who had personally led the army into battle. Only then did they obtain this treatment that was similar to lying down and taking credit. Who would have thought that before they even entered the range of the horse bow, each of them would be hit by 2 iron nails? Their flesh was badly mangled, and their hearts and livers were in pain. 2 cavalry armies had suffered heavy casualties of nearly 1,000 riders, yet none of them managed to pull out a single arrow from their quivers. In the end, they didn't even touch the walls of North Resisting City. How could the general not be frightened? On the rightmost battlefield of North Ju City, 2 people were blocking their horses. Wei Miao of Nanzhao and Chai Qing-shan of Dongyue's sword pool were 2 grandmasters of the Central Plains. They had never met each other before, so naturally, they had no chance to spar with each other. However, their cooperation was flawless. Wei Miao fought the Beimang cavalry with his bare hands. His moves were bold and decisive. Every time he punched, the momentum of his fist was heavy and powerful. Often, a charging horseman would have his arm and blade broken. The high-quality scimitar in the hands of a Beimang horseman was as fragile as a piece of paper. On the other hand, Chai Qing-shan had always been known for his exquisite swordsmanship and profound sword aura, which perfectly complemented Wei Miao's firm and fierce fists. Very soon, this grandmaster of swordsmanship no longer deliberately pursued killing moves that were as imposing as a rainbow. Instead, he mostly used 2 styles to kill the enemy. The sword light emitted from the tip of his sword was no more than 2 qi long, but it was already as if he was holding a 5 qi long sword. It was just enough for him to stand on the ground and accurately stab the Beimang horseman in the chest, or lightly slash the horseman's neck. His long sword was never dyed scarlet. At this time, Wei Miao suddenly changed from his previous vicious fist wind that could kill the enemy with 1 or 2 moves. Instead, he began to move in an arc, or perhaps he began to walk in the mud that didn't even reach his knees. His figure quickly moved about, twisting his waist and shaking his armor. Each time he faced the Northern Mang cavalry's warhorses with his shoulder and back, relying on his Vajra physique, he didn't have to worry about the hacking of war blades at all, instantly sending a border army warhorse flying. Because of Wei Miao's hurried footsteps, he was always able to find a gap between several riders. Even though Northern Mang consciously spread out the width of their charge, immediately forming a line of 7, 8, or even more than 10 riders in an attempt to break the stable formation of the 2 Central Plains grandmasters, doing their best to not give the 2 a chance to switch auras, Wei Miao's fast advance, fast retreat, fast attack, and fast retreat still stopped wave after wave of cavalry formation. Even though the Northern Mang cavalry already realized that they had to exchange the lives of 10 riders for a breath of air, only wishing to slowly exhaust these 2 Central Plains grandmasters to death, under this type of dangerous situation, Wei Miao's attacks that only targeted the mounts and not the Northern Mang soldiers began to contain powerful spiraling hidden energy, creating exaggerated and absurd scenes one after another. Many of the Northern Mang warhorses flew in directions that were simply inconceivable. They might fly to the sides, might fly backwards, might even fly upwards at an angle. These massive, hidden weapons made it impossible for the same line of Northern Mang cavalry and the cavalry behind them to guard against, greatly restricting the Northern Mang cavalry's attempts to quickly advance and form 2 encirclement rings. Even if there were some who slipped through the net and wanted to bypass Wei Miao and flank him from both sides, Chai Qingshan naturally wouldn't rigidly adhere to the rule of, you in front and I in back. As the master of a sect whose swordsmanship was the best in the southeast of Liang, did they really think that the old man's sword energy was only 2 feet long? After losing 200 to 300 riders, the Beimang cavalry was unwilling to retreat, and they didn't dare to cower from the battle. After losing 500 to 600 riders, the Chiliarch gritted his teeth and hoped that he could drag out the 2 martial arts masters to death by taking turns to fight them. After losing more than 1,000 riders, the commander of the cavalry, who had never dared to charge into the battle himself, was already in a killing frenzy. Knowing that there was no way out for him, he ordered all the cavalry under his command to abandon their sabers. They could only charge forward as fast as they could and use their warhorses to ram the 2 masters. After that, a total of 500 warhorses charged forward madly, as if they were committing suicide in front of the 2 grandmasters of the Central Plains. As long as the Beimang cavalry didn't pass out or die on the spot, they all stood up and pulled out their sabers to fight. The Beimang cavalry was indeed not the only elite in the world who didn't fear death. In the first battle of Liangmang, in Liangzhou's Huda City, Liuzhou's Gourd Pass, and Liuzhou's Qingsang City, the Beiliang frontier army didn't care about their own safety, and the Beimang soldiers also died in a spectacular fashion. In the second battle of Liangmang, from the Miyun Pass in the western regions, to the northern corridor in Liuzhou, to the battlefield of Crone Mountain, and then to the left cavalry against the Winter Thunder elite cavalry and the Ruren cavalry outside the Liangzhou Pass. In every battlefield, both sides of the enemy and their side killed each other to the core. Therefore, the Beimang had always believed that as long as they conquered Beiliang, they would have conquered the vast Central Plains. And the Beiliang had always believed that it really wasn't that they looked down on the elites of the Central Plains or the Tu Liao Iron Cavalry on purpose. As long as they were in a vast area where cavalry could gallop freely, once they encountered a large-scale grassland cavalry, no matter how many heads the Liang army had, they wouldn't be enough to be chopped off by the Beimang barbarians. In the middle of a conversation that was destined to be buried in the dust of history, Tantanon laughed and asked a certain close friend who always had his hands on the handle, if we annoy the Su family, they might as well rebel and join hands with the Beimang to invade the Central Plains. Then what should we do? Won't we become sinners for all eternity? You, Bai Yen, will be ranked first, and I, Huan Wen, will be ranked second? That Grand Secretary, who was like the sun in the midday sky in the Liang court, had an indifferent expression and gave a humorous answer that didn't match the horse's mouth. I only hope that when the time comes, all the officials in the court won't feel that the water of martyrdom for the country is too cold and the Liang family has no rope. Huan Wen was still in that court, still standing tall as the Tantanon. However, after autumn this year, he had gradually faded out of the court's view and almost didn't participate in the small court meetings. The old man lived in seclusion and became more and more silent, unwilling to speak with others. As a result, Grand Secretary Zhang Julu's opinion of the Beiliang Su family in the depths of his heart was even more unknown. In any case, as the battle between the Jiangnan aristocratic families and the Liaodong aristocratic families in the Liang court became more and more intense, some scholars, who were clean but carried righteousness on their shoulders, after gaining a firm foothold in Tian City, began to speak out. Their words shocked people to death, saying that the old traitor Zhang Julu not only dominated the court, he even secretly colluded with the Northwest Border Army and purposely raised a tiger to cause trouble in order to solidify his position. Although there weren't many of these people, their statuses were often not ordinary. They were seen as having a body of knowledge and ambition but could only be suppressed and ostracized by Zhang Lu, who was led by Bai Yen, who was jealous of their ability during the reign of Yong Hui. Now that the clouds had finally parted and the moon could see the light, they should speak out for justice and speak out for the common people. For a time, there was praise everywhere. They had the strength of a scholar, a master of morality, and a pillar of the country. These scholars, who were like carps jumping over the dragon's gate, or famous scholars who were born in the families of generals and ministers, were not many compared to the vast majority of normal scholars, but their voices were the loudest, and they had the most audiences. After this auspicious third year of autumn, at the highest point of the Tian City court, even the Ministry of War Yamen that had fought with the Northwest Su family for so many years, did not purposely hide the tragic victory at the Battle of Miyun. In addition to the news of the victory at Old Woman Mountain in Liuzhou that was sent to the capital via the Lianghuai Path's post house, as well as the complete annihilation of Lu Deyuan's Liangzhou left cavalry, the new administrator of the Lianghuai Path, Han Lin, and Jidushi Su Gong, reported everything to the court without missing a word. However, it was still very strange that the entire Taiyan city, from the large families deep in their courtyards to the noisy streets and alleys, did not discuss this matter from beginning to end. It was probably because the former were not willing to speak, and the latter could not hear. The common people of Liang at most heard that the Bailiang Su family had won a few small battles in Liuzhou and suffered a great defeat outside the Liangzhou Pass. Then, very quickly, they were surrounded by the hundreds of thousands of Bailiang's army in that Beijua city. No wonder this Taiyan city that had been used to watching clouds rise and fall for 20 years could not stop the rebel army of the three vassal kings advancing north. Its most urgent situation was that the Southern Expedition General Wu Zhongshuan, who was the Minister of War, personally led 100,000-strong southern troops. The two border armies of the Great Pillar State Gu Jiantang did not move. Chapter 2007. It was said that Tang Taizuang, the Assistant Minister of the Ministry of War who had inherited Gu Lu's legacy, was about to leave the capital and lead most of the elites in the capital to set up a second line of defense behind Wu Zhongshuan's army. They were only waiting for the two groups of Liaodong cavalry to come down south. At that time, they would be able to turn defense into offense and push the rebel army back to the south bank of Guangling River. The Shu soldiers of the white-clothed war Saint Shen Jibao, the barbarian soldiers of the Yan King Zhao Sun, and the lone king of Jing'an were not worth mentioning. For Liang, the two Liaodong border armies that had taken 20 years and half the country's power to build were the world's top elites right next to the Zhao family of Liang. They were like family right under the nose of Graydon City. They were the cornerstone of the country, the needle that stabilized the sea. The Su family of the Northwest had their own soldiers. How could they trust them? How could the Northern Liang Path, a barbaric place where there were as many schools as there were hairs on a cow and few scholars, have the right to sit at the same table as the great peace city that was the best in the world, the Guangling Path that was the richest in the Central Plains, and the Jiangnan Path that was full of literature? Outside Jexi City, it was probably the battle with the greatest disparity in military strength in history. Someone died. The deceased was the Southern Tang Confucian scholar Qingbai Shuang. This old scholar who had almost reached the Confucian saint realm and was a grandmaster of the Central Plains at the back of the battlefield with the blind female zither player Shui Songguan should have died last. The old man died of exhaustion. Wei Miao, Chai Qingshan, Lu Huang, and Yu Grum each blocked the 5,000 Beimang cavalry. Wu Luding of the Wu family's sword tomb, sword attendant Suehua, and Su Yanbing with his spear behind him firmly blocked the advance of the 10,000-men army on the left flank of Beimang. Mao Shulang of the Southern Plains, Ji Lu, and of the Dragon Palace, and Yu Xingrui of the Wudong Mountain were already surrounded by the 10,000-men infantry on the right flank and the two reinforcements. Among them were almost 1,000 spider web warriors and Beimang Jianghu masters. In northern Mang's middle formation, the red-robed Suing and Luoyang, who had withdrawn from the center of the army, joined hands. Together with Sui Xiegu, whose sword energy crisscrossed, providing support from the rear, they finally managed to hold back the surging tide that surged south. During this period of time, even though Luoyang had made a trip to northern Mang's crossbow base and unleashed a great slaughter, when faced with more than 2,000 catapult carts that were located in a long arc, it still seemed like the will was willing, but the strength was lacking. Moreover, if she targeted these siege weapons, with just Suing and Sui Xiegu blocking the infantrymen in the middle, as well as the cavalry army that continuously charged through the two wide corridors, it was extremely likely for the two of them to completely sink into the mud. After Su Yanbing and Yu Xingrui had to go to the left and the right flank, Su Fengnian had to confront Tuoba Bodhisattva, and Dong Tai had to face the celestial being to ensure that the young king could fight Beimang's god of war without any worries. Otherwise, Tuoba Bodhisattva, who was already blessed by nature, and had the celestial being constantly fanning the flames above his head, once he successfully climbed to the peak of martial arts, even if Tuoba Bodhisattva only took 30 minutes to become the first person in 500 years, Su Fengnian, who always had to be distracted, would have no chance of surviving. Not to mention killing Tuoba Bodhisattva, even returning to North resisting city alive was a luxury. In this way, Luo Yang had to deal with the awkward situation of being a clever housewife who could not cook without rice. She had to be restrained. Otherwise, with her cultivation realm, under the premise that Xianyuan Qingfeng had already entangled Deng Mao, Murong Baoding, and Zhong Liang did not come to stop her, it was not impossible for her to enter Bei Mang's army as if she was invincible. Not only could she destroy half of the catapults, but she could also retreat successfully. Previously, Xue Songguan plucked the strings with his fingers, and the old Confucian scholar with white hair on his temples used his noble spirit to block round after round of catapults, and wave after wave of arrow rain besieging the city. Whether it was the thrown boulders or the locust-like arrows, the most fatal thing was not the aggressive and overwhelming kind, but the dense and rapid way in which they were thrown. At that time, Xue Songguan, who was sitting cross-legged, saw the drops of blood on the guqin on his legs, the broken strings, and the bloody flesh on the fingers of the blind female guqin master. All of these silently told the truth that she, who was not known for her strong physique, was almost at the end of her rope. Therefore, Qing Baishuang told Xue Songguan not to force himself and let him, an old man, carry the burden. In the old man's words, there was no reason to let a young woman like Miss Xue take on such a heavy responsibility. A young woman like her could only be considered a good thing in the world if she could take care of her husband and children. Not only that, when the old Confucian scholar noticed that his old friend Ji Lu and the other grandmasters on his right were in danger, he made a prompt decision and asked Xue Songguan to go and help. They must not let the large number of Bei Mang infantry reach the city walls too early. The young blind female guqin master was hesitant. Although she could not see the old man's haggard appearance with her own eyes, how could Xue Songguan, who was ranked in the top 3 in the finger xian skill, not sense the old man's dying breath and the old man's dying breath? She knew in her heart that if she left, the old man would certainly die. She could not bear to. Although the old man and the young woman had only met for a short time and fought side by side without asking for reasons, Xue Songguan already saw this old man from the distant southern Tang kingdom as her own elder. Perhaps he was as old-fashioned as this old man's son Zhao Dingxiu and had a scholarly spirit that she was unfamiliar with. But in the end, he was a kind and benevolent old man. Miss Xue, you must not delay the war. Qing Baishuang took a deep breath and forcefully swallowed a mouthful of blood that had already surged up her throat. When she saw the young woman stand up with her guqin, she tried her best to speak gently with a smile. Miss Xue, there was once a famous writer in Jiangnan who was exiled to our country. Before he died in a foreign land, he left behind many poems that were not widely circulated. Among them, there were 2 lines that this old man must pass on to Xue Songguan: I eat 300 lychees a day, and I travel the most in my life. Miss Xue, if you have the chance in the future, you must go there and take a look. If you don't want to enjoy the scenery, lychees that are as expensive as gold in the north are only a few dozen copper coins a caddy in our country. At this point, Qing Baishuang suddenly stomped her foot and her strength penetrated deep into the ground. She raised her arm and waved her sleeve, like a calligraphy master splashing ink on a piece of paper. Then she seemed to have thought of something interesting and laughed loudly. After a few breaths, she slowly said, Miss Xue, if you don't have someone you like, in the future, you might as well find a scholar to grow old with. Although it's hard to avoid sour words, at least there's no need to buy vinegar at home. Xue Songguan, whose back was already to the old man, did not turn around. She only nodded vigorously. She flashed away. Qing Baishuang retracted her gaze and sat cross-legged with her eyes closed. At this moment, the old man with a head full of frost and snow could no longer hide his exhaustion. Although every time he waved his sleeve, it would bring about a heart-wrenching turbulence in Qi Ji, the old man was always calm. He muttered to himself, but if I feel that there are ghosts and gods in the song, how can I know that I'll starve to death to fill the ravine? Therefore, I can't do it. Don't think about your homeland in front of an old friend, and try a new tea with a new fire. But I can't do it. Qing Baishuang felt the magnificent sword rain above her head. The old man who was holding his breath to prevent his dantian from drying up was too weak to turn his head and open his eyes. He could only vaguely feel that the sword rain fell in the Bei Mang formation on the side of Xue Songguan. The old man smiled with relief. The country's misfortune is the poet's fortune. First, I hope that there will be no more frontier poems and no more great poets in the future. Second, I hope that the scholars in the future will be happy and forget their worries. They don't know that old age is coming. They don't know that old age is coming. Qing Baishuang raised her arm for the last time. She was wearing a long robe with wide sleeves, looking like a scholar. The child asked, "Why is it too late to return? Why is it too late to return?" When her arm fell down, the old man's lips moved slightly, but he could no longer raise his arm. The old man lowered his head silently in front of the hundreds of thousands of Beimang troops with his back facing the Beimang city, which was the northwest gate of the Central Plains. During Qing Baishuang's lifetime, Beimang had never let a huge rock or a crossbow arrow fall into the Beimang city. Who said that a scholar was a useless scholar? Sui Xiegu, who was the closest to this remnant of the old southern Tang, did not turn his head. He sighed softly. Originally, with the place where he stood as the center, there were more than 100 snow-white sword auras that were as thick as the mouth of a bull within 20 feet. Suddenly, the sword auras expanded to 10 feet, and there were 60 more sword auras. More than 80 shield-wielding infantrymen who were cautiously moving forward were killed instantly. Their ending was even more miserable than being torn apart by 5 horses. Ji Luan, the foreign minister of Dragon Palace who was fighting in the middle of Beimang's infantrymen on the right, split a heavily armored Beimang centurion in half with his sword. He suddenly turned his head and roared, "Old bookbag." At this moment, 7 or 8 spears stabbed toward him. The master bladesman, Mao Shulang, took a big step forward and blocked in front of Ji Luan. He swept his blade horizontally, and the vigorous upstanding chi swept out, cutting all the Beimang infantrymen in half. The great immortal of Wudong, Yu Xingrui, shouted, "How dare you!" The peachwood sword in his hand flashed and pierced through the necks of 3 spider-web death soldiers beside Mao Shulang. The power of the sword was so powerful that the flying sword of the immortals took their heads. On the left side of the battlefield, Yu Groom and Lu Huang, the 2 apprentice brothers of Martial Emperor City, one was called Cold Blade, and the other was called Sword Shudao. Both sides advanced side by side. Since Su Yanbing was at the back to help block the infantrymen, these 2 apprentices of Wang Xianji were completely at ease and advanced forward. Chapter 2008. With a half-step martial sage guarding the rear, there was no need to worry about blocking. They only needed to focus on killing. Yu Groom and Lu Huang seemed to be more powerful than Ji Lu and the other 2. Lu Huang's sword momentum was strong and his sword moves were simple. Like a woodcutter chopping firewood, no matter if it was a Beimang soldier or a warhorse, under one sword, there was no complete corpse. Yu Groom put away the cold blade that was about to break and put it back into the scabbard. He pulled out the ancient sword Fu Ji that had been vibrating in the scabbard for a long time. He still casually pointed and pointed. Yu Groom moved like a hare and a falcon fell like a falcon, appearing and disappearing like a ghost. Although his killing momentum was not as terrifying as Lu Huang's, even Su Yanbing was surprised when he noticed the subtle change in this person's chi. As expected of Wang Xianji's first disciple, Yu Groom actually showed signs of breaking through in the battlefield. Naturally, he was only one step away from becoming a land sword immortal. Although even after stabilizing his realm, he was still not a real land immortal. As long as his realm reached that level, it would not be comparable to a mysterious celestial and celestial swordsman who accidentally comprehended 1 or 2 sword immortal sword moves. He would probably be the second person after Dong Tai. Bridegroom used sword pressed against the space between the brows of a northern Mang soldier. He didn't look at the corpse that fell off the horse, instead jumping onto the horse's back. He looked forward and reminded Lu Huang in front of him with a sunken voice, "Northern Mang has another 1,000 elite cavalry that is currently hurrying over." Lu Huang was about to speak, but Yu Groom had already rushed forward with a laugh, "Let me fight him first." On the far right, just as Chai Qingshan and Wei Miao were changing their positions at the critical moment, a silhouette as swift as a startled swan smashed down from above. A fist as powerful as a thunderbolt hammered into the chest of Chai Qingshan, who was just about to retreat. Even though this sword master whose name Shuk Li Yang had already subconsciously placed his sword horizontally in front of him and used the tip of his sword to meet the enemy, hoping to make the uninvited guest retreat in the face of difficulties, he didn't expect that the fist still collided with the tip of his sword without any hesitation. The Dongyue sword pool sect master, who was currently taking a breather and had already fought for a long time, was caught off guard, actually being injured by his own longsword. Fortunately, Wei Miao quickly rushed forward, grabbing Chai Qingshan's shoulder with one hand and pulling him back, while blocking the second fist of that Northern Mang martial grandmaster with the other. Taking advantage of the momentum, Chai Qingshan flew back over 30 meters. A bloody groove was cut on his chest so deep that his bones could be seen. Blood gushed out and soaked his clothes. As Wei Miao's left hand clenched that fist, because his right hand had to help Chai Qingshan dodge the sword, his second punch was slower than the Beimang experts by a hair's breadth. However, it was precisely this hair's breadth that allowed the shrewd and treacherous assassin to gain the upper hand. Wei Miao was punched in the forehead. Wei Miao stomped his feet and only took half a step back before stopping himself. He refused to take a single step back. From this, one could see the unyielding nature of the number one expert of Nanzhao. Wei Miao exchanged blows with the newcomer. Both sides took 3 steps back. Wei Miao's fist landed on that person's chest, while his own forehead suffered another punch. With his head heavily injured, Wei Miao's ears were already oozing blood. In his blurred vision, the Beimang general clad in shining silver armor laughed savagely. Wei Miao is a fist, but there's no fist in the world. The one I'm going to kill is you. While the tall general was speaking, Chai Qingshan hastily took a deep breath and was about to reverse the situation for Wei Miao. But at this moment, the old man heard the blind zither player behind him shout, "Watch out above your head." A second Beimang assassin with a ghostly figure descended from the sky without a sound or a trace of qi. He was like a wandering ghost. The silver-armored general's opening was clearly a deliberate diversion. Perhaps this was the true killing move of the 2 Beimang grandmasters after they had worked together. Chai Qingshan quickly took a step back. As Shui Songguan gave the warning, his palm brushed viciously across the zither strings. But a scene that caused the blind zither player to feel grief and indignation appeared. The assassin completely ignored the heavy wound in his chest, as if he could not feel the slightest bit of pain. The extremely slender, 4-foot-long sword in his hand, without sword aura or sword light, chopped straight down between Chai Qingshan's eyebrows. Beimang's willow, Li Fengshuo's haunting spirit. On the brink of life and death, Chai Qingshan still used all his strength to deliver what might be the last strike of his life. It pierced straight for that person's heart. The master of the Dongyue sword pool only hoped that this strike would be able to pierce that person's heart. I, Chai Qingshan, don't care if I die. It's good if I can kill one more person. Originally, he should have used this chance to have Li Fengshuo kill Chai Qingshan, and then have the silver-armored general use his fists to kill the unstable Wei Miao. That would have been the best situation for both sides to win. But at this moment, Chai Qingshan suddenly realized that although the longsword had left a deep gash in his forehead, it only needed a little more strength to break open his head. If there was a little more strength, it would not be difficult to dismember his body. But that assassin with extremely strange swordsmanship chose to be merciful. At the same time, the silver-armored general of Beimang's Orange Province, Murong Baoding, seemed to have been immobilized by an immortal, wasting a rare opportunity to deliver a punch. Chai Qingshan's eyes widened. Even the old man, who was a seasoned sword grandmaster, felt that the scene in front of him was too absurd. The Beimang assassin in front of him was suspended in the air, his arms drooping, and the willow longsword falling to the ground. A section of willow Li Fengshuo's head was grabbed by the neck by someone behind him and lifted in the air. Murong Baoding did not dare to move. He was unbelievably obedient. Even though he could clearly see that person's back. It was a purple-gold robe. The king of Bailiang who broke through the sea of clouds and returned to the human world, Su Fengnian. The young king's 5 fingers were like hooks, completely destroying the qi inside the body of this section of willow. The soft and boneless Li Fengshuo twitched the corner of his mouth and smiled gloomily. In an instant, Wei Miao wanted to punch, and Chai Qingshan wanted to use his sword, but they were too slow. The 2 top martial arts grandmasters believed that even if they were in their peak state, they would not be able to stop the surprise attack of the 3rd assassin of Beimang. The young king's back suffered an unimaginable heavy blow. After a slight shift of his footsteps, his whole body bypassed Chai Qingshan and crashed into the towering wall of the North City. Wei Miao and Chai Qingshan retreated almost at the same time. Unexpectedly, that person did not have the intention to chase after them. He stood in the same place, looked at the base of the wall, and sneered, "You really want to die?" Su Fengnian did not obediently hide in the sea of clouds and rely on the protection of Dong Tai to completely stabilize his qi. Instead, he dared to come back to the battlefield to save others. Murong Baoding glanced at the man standing next to him with mixed feelings. Even if he knew that they were in the same camp and their status was not too different, Murong Baoding still could not help but feel as if he was facing a great enemy. He did not dare to take it lightly. Murong Baoding whispered, "What about that section of willow?" The burly man surrounded by 18 golden dragons did not speak. Murong Baoding's eyes were gloomy, but he did not continue to ask. Under the city walls of North Barricade, Su Fengnian, who had his back to the battlefield, was still holding Li Fengshuo's neck. Li Fengshuo was pressed against the wall, and his face was a bloody mess. It would not be an exaggeration to say that his body had been smashed to pieces. Su Fengnian smiled and asked, "You didn't die when I cut you in half last time, but you should be dead this time, right?" The section of willow of Beimang, whose real identity was hidden and prominent, opened his mouth slightly, as if he wanted to laugh happily, but he could not laugh. He said in a hoarse voice, "Me? I'd rather be dead. It's not a loss to have you, Su Fengnian, accompany me in death." Su Fengnian said, "Oh." Li Fengshuo slowly closed his eyes, as if he had been relieved of a great burden. He said intermittently, "Don't worry. I'm really going to die this time, but I'll tell you one last secret. I don't need Tuoba Bodhisattva to avenge me. I, Li Fengshuo, can do it myself." Su Fengnian, do you believe me? Su Fengnian twisted his neck and laughed, "Guess?" Su Fengnian threw away the corpse, turned around, and looked up at the sky. He knew what Tuoba Bodhisattva was waiting for. The suppression of the heavenly Tao that Beimang had planned had two uses. First, it would wear down his Bailiang destiny. This was what the immortals in the heavens cared about the most. Next, it would destroy his body, and add flowers to the brocade of the Beimang military god. Because he had not expected Zhao Chengling to lead many exiled immortals to land in Bailiang and add so much destiny to Bailiang, and then Dong Tai arrived with Taya and slashed through the air, the pillar of light targeted at him had to be retracted early. As to where half of the heavenly Tao was, Su Fengnian did not know and did not care, but it definitely had something to do with this dead branch of the willow. Li Fengshuo was more or less the primer. Whoever killed this illegitimate son of Li Mibi would attract the next suppression. Su Fengnian was sure that even if he did not kill Li Fengshuo, this madman would stretch out his neck for him to chop. Maybe Li Fengshuo had a deeper identity, and was a banished immortal. In his previous life, he was the ruler of a country destroyed by Su Shao, or traced back to before the Great Qin. In short, it was an old debt that could not be settled by reason for several lifetimes. Su Fengnian had long seen through it. Too much debt was not a burden, but since there was no next life, he would resolve it completely in this life. Su Fengnian walked out of the shadows step by step. On and below the city walls, this Liang Wang tore off the python robe. His clothes were like snow. Just like when white robes left Liangzhou. This young man who no longer wanted to be some bullshit Liang vassal king smiled brightly for no reason. Then he raised his head and said in a clear voice, "Su Zhao's eldest son, Su Fengnian, seeks death here." Chapter 2009. Previously, the Northern Mang war god, the young vassal king, the peach blossom sword deity, and the white-clothed Luo Yang had left the Northern Mang army's hinterland one after another. Only Mount Huishan-zi, who insisted on continuing to advance, was left to face Deng Mao and the layers upon layers of grassland cavalry alone. Deng Mao with the broken spear couldn't help but admire the courage of this Central Plains woman. She was not inferior to any man in the world. Deng Mao, who had always been a man of few words, couldn't help but ask, "Xianyuan Qingfeng, why do you have to do this?" Xianyuan Qingfeng had broken through the enemy's formation so far, and her killing intent was extremely heavy. Her attacks were worthy of the saying, strength like a bowstring, strike like a thunderclap. Along the way, no matter whether it was the heavily armored infantry or the elite cavalry, as long as they were touched by her, they would definitely die without a complete corpse. The reason why she could be called the twin jade annulus of Liang, together with the young feudal lord, was not only because of her extremely high realm, but also because her foundation, both her body and qi, was very solid. The qi in her body was both vigorous and long. Xianyuan Qingfeng put her hands behind her back. On the battlefield, the south wind blew, and this mistress of the great snow meadow, whose back was facing Beiming City, had her hair and skirt fluttering to the north. She was as beautiful as a goddess. Deng Mao had followed Luo Yang and Yelu Dongchuang to Mount Zhulu in the Central Plains years ago, and even intercepted the convoy that was escorting Gao Shulu south to Guangling Road. He had followed the two of them around Liang, so he was not unfamiliar with the Jianghu of the Central Plains. He was a nominal guest of Yelu Dongchuang's branch of the Yelu family, which was somewhat similar to Huang Fangfua of Mount Huishan and Ji Lu and of Dragon Palace. His status was relatively high, but it was not as simple as a vine attached to a tree. It was said that when Deng Mao was defeated in the grassland, Yelu Hongkai, who was respectfully called Old Lord by the nobles of Norland, helped him and honored him as a distinguished guest. Deng Mao was naturally grateful. If he said that he had no friendship with Luo Yang, he would be deceiving himself and others. In fact, the proud and arrogant Deng Mao respected Luo Yang very much, not only because of the affection between a man and a woman, but also because of the admiration of a kindred spirit. However, Deng Mao's ambition was to reach the peak of martial arts, so his shallow feelings for the hierarch of Mount Zhulu had always been buried deep in his heart, like a jar of old wine buried underground. He did not need to take it out to drink, nor did he want to part with it. As long as he occasionally remembered it, he seemed to be able to smell the wine lingering at the tip of his nose. At this moment, the two were confronting each other. In terms of cultivation level, Deng Mao was a grandmaster of Beimang from the same era as Zhong Liang and Murong Baoding. As a senior of Mount Huishan, Deng Mao was actually half a realm lower than Xianyuan Qingfeng. He was only an ordinary heavenly phenomenon cultivator, far from reaching the threshold of earth immortal. However, even someone as conceited as Xianyuan Qingfeng did not act rashly. She did not think that she could easily surpass this man and take the head of the crown prince of Beimang. From this, one could see her fear of Deng Mao. Of course, Xianyuan Qingfeng also had the intention of accumulating his qi to recover to his peak, so he didn't deliberately conceal it. Deng Mao's not stopping him might seem like he was underestimating his opponent, but it was actually a kind of trade-off. Xianyuan Qingfeng's qi was indeed steadily rising, but the momentum from before was slightly decreasing. Deng Mao actually did not want to see this legendary woman die prematurely. However, seeing Xianyuan Qingfeng's attitude, Deng Mao knew that it was useless to say more. Since he was able to be placed near the Tianyuan of this chessboard by Beimang's peace order, as the most important chess piece to keep the king of Beiliang in check of Su Fengnian, how could Deng Mao's trump card, which he did not have time to use against Su Fengnian, be judged by common sense? Xianyuan Qingfeng's black hair fluttered wantonly. Her heart was as calm as still water. If the peach blossom sword god Dong Tai was at the highest point of the battlefield, then she was undoubtedly at the northernmost point of the north-resisting city. Deng Mao finally laughed loudly and asked, "You really don't regret it?" Xianyuan Qingfeng's expression was indifferent. She did not say any heroic words. Xianyuan Jingqing's daughter never knew what regret was in this life. Deng Mao took a heavy step forward. Xianyuan Qingfeng, whose purple clothes were stained with blood, rushed forward almost at the same time. Both of them tacitly chose to fight in close quarters. Life and death would be decided within 10 feet. The Beimang banner fluttered in the wind, stirring up waves of ripples and flapping noises. Beimang's crown prince Yelu Hongkai, who was clad in golden armor, had a gloomy expression. The magnificent beam of light, which symbolized the majesty of the way of heaven, had descended from the sky and landed in the open space in front of the crown prince. Yelu Hongkai had not expected that under such terrifying suppression, the young king of Liang had not been reduced to powder and could still escape. This was tantamount to slapping the crown prince in the face. He did not forget to say, "See you later." Yellow Honkai had been forced to endure and lie dormant for more than 10 years due to the circumstances, and had developed a considerable shrewdness. However, at the peak of his life, when he felt that the entire Central Plains was already in his bag, the new King Liang had shouldered the way of heaven with his own strength. This caused Yellow Honkai, who had an army of 400,000, to feel a strong sense of resentment. Every blade was carved into his heart. People in the world were most afraid of comparison. Beauties, famous generals, power, and wealth were all like this. Before Yellow Honkai had met Su Fengnian, he had heard so much about the news of the butchering eldest son in recent years that calluses had formed in his ears. As for Su Fengnian, who had successfully ousted Chen Jibao and eventually succeeded in inheriting the throne, Yellow Honkai actually felt a kind of complex sympathy for each other deep in his heart. This was why he had the Beimang princess, who had assumed the pseudonym Fan Bainu, sneak into Liangzhou and take the initiative to convey his goodwill to the young king of Liangzhou. Chapter 2010. Yellow Honkai glanced at a rider in the distance. She was gathered with 4 or 5 people from the chess and sword music school. They were probably discussing how to stop those grandmasters from the Central Plains. Yellow Honkai looked at her without the slightest gentleness. Even though she had shared a bed with him for more than 10 years, she still maintained a respectful relationship with him. She suddenly turned her head and looked at him. Yellow Honkai immediately squeezed out a warm smile. She nodded at him and then turned back to continue her discussion with the others. When she withdrew her gaze, Yellow Hongsai's expression quickly became ice-cold. When a timid imperial guard Shui stealthily arrived at his side, the gentle expression that appeared on Yellow Hongsai's face this time came from the bottom of his heart. In this vast prairie, the only person this northern Mang crown prince could share some intimate words with was actually this person at his side. Different from the Fergana horse that Yellow Honkai rode, the retainer's mount was a tall, snow-white steed that exuded a glossy luster similar to fine jade. The young rider wore a slightly large helmet that covered his eyebrows, revealing half of his extremely feminine and handsome face. Yellow Honkai looked at the retainer, carefully maintaining a distance from him, his eyes revealing undisguised affection. He smiled softly and said, "Come closer, there's no harm." The young rider narrowed his naturally charming eyes and looked at the battlefield in the south. He slowly said, "Horses galloping from the north are full of arrogance, singing from the south is full of death. The first half is appropriate, but the second half is not." The Beimang crown prince, who was not familiar with poetry and disdained to pretend to be cultured, couldn't help but ask curiously, "What do you mean? Is there an allusion to it?" The personal retainer with the title of bodyguard Shui rolled his eyes boldly and said angrily, "Even if we conquer the Central Plains in the future, with your little knowledge, how are you going to deal with the refugees of Liang in the future?" Yellow Honkai laughed loudly and suddenly lowered his voice. "Don't I have you?" The young cavalryman curled his lips and looked at the eye-catching bright purple dress in the distance. He clicked his tongue and said, "A woman should be content with her life." Yellow Honkai followed his retinue's line of sight and saw Xianyuan Qingfeng fighting Deng Mao with the broken spear. He said disapprovingly, "So what if he's good at martial arts?" Including Su Fengnian, there are a total of 18 martial arts masters outside the northern city. They won't be able to escape death even if they fight against our grassland cavalry. The best ending for this alliance chief of the Great Snow Plateau was to die under Deng Mao's broken spear, or die in the charge of the cavalry. Otherwise, surviving on the battlefield would only be worse than death. With her status and appearance, once she becomes a prisoner and her cultivation is destroyed, I'm afraid that even some old tycoons in the western capital will buy her for thousands of taels of gold, not to mention the Duke of Norland. The young cavalryman's face darkened as he lamented, "If that day really comes, Xianyuan Qingfeng would already be dead the moment he lost his martial arts. It's like the generals and ministers in the imperial court. As long as they lose their official status, it's the same as having their backbone pulled out." Yellow Honkai didn't believe that Xianyuan Qingfeng could be a threat to him at all. He said calmly, "The beauties of the world are like the weeds on our grassland. There are more every year. Although Xianyuan Xingfeng's beauty is indeed rare, we can still find many peerless beauties in the grassland and the central plains in the future if we search hard. To be honest, the women who made it into the Rouge Review in the past all had prominent identities without exception. It's as difficult as ascending to the heavens for women of ordinary birth to make it into the rankings. So, in the end, the men who hold power in the world like women's faces, but they like the clothes they wear even more. For example, the young cavalryman glanced sideways at the Beimang crown princess who had met with the two officials at some point and sneered, for example, her? Yelu Hongkai said half-jokingly, her? She'll probably only make it into the next Rouge Review after she becomes the empress. After a moment of silence, Yelu Hongkai turned and said seriously, you're different. You're different from her and them. The cavalryman didn't turn to look at Yelu Hongkai after hearing this. He only raised his head slightly and said arrogantly, of course. There was once a prophecy that was widely spread in Jianzhou at the southeastern border of Liang. However, after the dust settled at the Bull Mound, it had long since disappeared. A female brings back a male. The female is capable of toppling cities and the male is capable of toppling countries. Both of them fly into Wudong Palace. The square formation of Beimang's middle infantry was cut in half at the waist by two white and red robes. Luo Yang and Suing responded to each other on the left and right. The number of infantrymen that slipped behind them each time was no more than 300. The one-armed forefather eater sword stood behind the two female grandmasters. Within a radius of 200 feet, streaks of sword qi flowed like rainbows. Those who trespassed were killed on the spot as if they were walking into a trap. Not only that, Sui Xiagu's white robe fluttered and his eyebrows fluttered. He stroked his long eyebrows and muttered, set up the formation. Of the remaining flying swords that were left behind by the young vassal lord, more than 2,000 undamaged longswords were pulled out of the ground one by one. The longswords soared into the air and connected with each other. They landed in front of Sui Xiagu and stabbed into the ground. More than 1,000 swords formed a row. There were a total of 2 rows. They lined up neatly in front of Forefather Eater sword. The sword formation formed a step formation. Sui Xiagu closed his eyes and smiled. He muttered to himself, the cornerstone of the river rises suddenly. The rolling flood, the vast eternal spring. Sui Xiagu suddenly took a deep breath. Another 2,000 broken flying swords landed behind the old man. However, these long swords didn't stab into the ground. Instead, they hovered in the air, forming a sword formation. Finally, Sui Xiagu took another deep breath. Suddenly, the tall and sturdy old man's body emitted a dazzling white light. Sui Xiagu, who had swallowed countless famous swords in the world, scattered the sword qi that he had accumulated for 100 years into the 2 great formations. Every flying sword was imbued with a strand of sharp sword qi. In a split second, it was as if they had gained spirituality. Regardless of whether it was the step formation or the crossbow formation, the 4,000 swords of the 2 great formations trembled and wailed at the same time. The old man muttered softly, Li Chungang, you broke 2,600 swords at the Guangling River. I, Sui Xiagu, am not willing to lose to you. The old man who had exchanged an arm with Li Chungang of the spring and autumn sword armor passed away with a smile. The 2 sword formations were formed in tandem. 100 years of spirit was exhausted in 3 breaths. Chapter 2011. Beimang's god of war and the young king of vassal state, the 2 enemies who might decide the fate of countless people in Liangmang, intentionally or otherwise, moved the battlefield away from North Resisting City. The former was probably afraid of Su Fengnian's fate of Bailiang that had not been exhausted by the way of heaven. Once he had North Resisting City as his backing, he might be able to suppress Tuoba Bodhisattva's trump card. The latter was more worried that once the 2 entered North Resisting City and fought, it was very likely that the victory of the 18 Grandmasters would be completely nullified by Tuoba Bodhisattva's wanton destruction. When Su Fengnian floated away, he told Wei Miao and Chai Qingshan to be careful, who still needed to confront thousands of cavalry. The current leader of Dongyue's sword pool signaled the young king of vassal state not to worry about the battle here. Su Fengnian clasped his fist to the two grandmasters of the Central Plains who had disregarded life and death as a sign of gratitude. Chai Qingshan laughed it off, his chest was filled with pride. The space between Chai Qingshan's eyebrows was split open, and his chest was cut by a Beimang willow. However, compared to Chai Qingshan, who looked miserable but did not suffer any injuries, Wei Miao of the southern Zhao was the one who was seriously injured, whether in terms of physique or qi. Wei Miao was worthy of being the #1 master of southwest Jianghu. Whether in terms of physique, martial arts attainment, or improvisation, he could be said to be the world's top martial artist. However, the sneak attack by Murong Baoding, nicknamed Half-Faced Buddha, and Li Fengshou, the spider web assassin, was too insidious and vicious. Wei Miao took 2 full punches from Murong Baoding, especially the punch on his head, which actually caused his eardrums to burst and blood clots to form in his brain. If it were not for Su Fengnian's attitude of wanting to kill Murong Baoding at the cost of losing the initiative while holding back Tuoba Bodhisattva, the restless Beimang did not dare to make a move. This bought Wei Miao a moment of respite, and also allowed Chai Qingshan's momentum to recover slightly. Otherwise, it would have been difficult for the two grandmasters to turn the situation around with the 4,000 Winter Thunder cavalry from Orange Province and Murong Baoding, who was eyeing them covetously. In fact, if Murong Baoding had the courage to gamble with his own life and decisively chose to attack Wei Miao to win the initiative for Tuoba Bodhisattva, perhaps the young king would have fallen into a difficult situation under North resisting city. It might even have been possible to end the Second Great War of Liang Mang ahead of time. However, Tuoba Bodhisattva did not bother to take the initiative to ask for help from this Great War of Liang Mang. Secondly, Murong Baoding, who was ambitious and wanted to be in the Central Plains, finally obtained a great victory that shook the world outside Liangzhou Pass. He defeated Lu Dayuan's left cavalry, and his great military achievement was enough to compare to the First Great War of Liang Mang when the king of the Southern Academy, Dong Zhuo, broke through Huda city. How could Murong Baoding be willing to take the risk for others? Lastly, in the ambush on the Longyan Plains, the king of New Liang killed Hong Jingyan right under Tuoba Bodhisattva's nose. This made Murong Baoding have to think carefully. Murong Baoding was not in a hurry to make a move. He looked at the two martial masters of the Central Plains, Wei Miao and Chai Qingshan, and said in a clumsy Central Plains official's accent, "There is Lu Dayuan on the battlefield, and there is Wei Miao and Chai Qingshan in the Jianghu. God has treated me, Murong Baoding, badly for more than 40 years, and finally treated me well for once. There is a saying in the Central Plains that goes, mountains and rivers repeat, but there is no way out." Very wonderful, it really sets the scene. After Tuoba Bodhisattva and the young vassal left the place, Murong Baoding, who was wearing silver armor, suddenly had an imposing manner. In the Beimang Jianghu, this member of the royal family, who was originally only known for his rough skin and thick flesh, was ranked very low even if he was on the list of previous martial arts evaluations. This was because Murong Baoding was known to be good at defense and not good at offense. Compared to Zhong Liang, who had directly entered the finger mystery realm from a second-grade master, they could be said to be the two extremes of Beimang's martial arts. However, Murong Baoding had brazenly injured Wei Miao with 2 punches. It was obvious that he had been hiding his strength for so many years. Even when he joined forces with Zhong Liang to ambush Su Fengnian in Qingsang City in the early years, he still deliberately hid his cultivation from beginning to end. When it came to tolerance, Murong Baoding was indeed well versed in it. Wei Miao was silent and slowly inhaled and exhaled. Since this Beimang was willing to talk loudly, Wei Miao naturally would not take the initiative to seek a quick battle. Chai Qingshan held the meter-long sword with a calm expression. The poem from Murong Baoding's mouth was very popular in the Central Plains. However, this half-baked northern Mang prince probably did not know where it came from. It was the poem Banishing Liangzhou to Die of Old Age, written by the son of the poet family who won first place in the last years of the Great Feng dynasty. Mountains and rivers repeated, willows dark and flowers bright. Just from the words alone, it had always been the most fascinating scenery of Jiangnan. The spring sun was bright and beautiful, the grass was long and the birds were flying. The scenery was pleasant, how could it not make people forget to return? On the other hand, the northwest of the Great Wall was barren, the yellow soil was barren, and the ravines were crisscrossed. The sky was high and the clouds were low. In this part of the world, the two dragons' strength rushed towards one's face and directly hit one's chest. The desolate and cold atmosphere seemed to make the foreigners take a few steps back before they were willing to give up. Chai Ching-shan walked to Wei Miao's side and smiled. There is Wei Miao in the fist, there is no fist in the world. You deserve it. Wei Miao grinned slightly but did not make a sound. Su Fengnian had once joked that he had seen countless experts and grandmasters in his life. Among them, the red-robed man-cat Han Xingxian, the #1 swordsman in the capital, Qi Jiajia, and the purple-robed Xianyuan Qingfeng of Mount Hui were the most impressive. Li Chungang, Jian Jiuhuang, and Wei Miao were the least like masters. Chai Ching-shan continued with a smile, since the world cannot be without Wei Miao, there are countless young talents in the sword forest of the Central Plains. If 1 or 2 old guys die, there will always be a few rising stars to replace them. Just the Dongyue sword pool alone has my 2 disciples, Shan Yi and Song Tinglu. They are destined to rise in the future. Therefore, Wei Miao, I will fight this battle first. What Chai Ching-shan meant was, I will die first. Wei Miao, who urgently needed to recuperate, did not reject the kindness of this sword master. He said in a low voice, I, Wei Miao, will not boast in my life. I can only promise that I will not let Brother Chai leave alone. Chai Ching-shan hesitated and sighed, Brother Wei, don't die if you can. You are different from me. There are still people waiting for you in North Rejecting City. Unexpectedly, Wei Miao, who was short and had a white cloth tied around his calves, smiled and clenched his fists. He squinted his eyes and said softly, after she married me, we traveled Jianghu for so many years. Because my appearance is too ordinary and I do not like to be in the limelight, I will not fight if I can avoid trouble. She, who has a lively personality, is so beautiful as a flower. It seems that she has never felt that she married a good family and always laughed at the man she married for not having enough heroic spirit. Therefore, today, as her man, I, Wei Miao, will do one thing for her. Wei Miao did not speak anymore. Murong Baoding smiled proudly. Do you two have any last words? In the future, when I, Murong Baoding, enter the Central Plains, I will reminisce about the past with the officials of the Central Plains. It will also be something to talk about. Chai Ching-shan held his sword in front of him, shook his head and laughed loudly. A Beimang dog's head is not worth much. It is really an insult to my newly forged sword, Green Water. Murong Baoding's face was gloomy. He clicked his tongue and said, It is said that there are 2 sword schools in the world. Since someone has taken care of the withered sword of the Wu family's sword tomb, let me experience the new sword of the Dongyue sword pool. Chai Ching-shan tapped the ground with the tip of his foot and his body swept forward. A bright green rainbow swept across Murong Baoding's chest. A deathbed struggle. You are only half as strong as you were in your heyday. So what if I let you, old dog surnamed Chai, attack me 100 times first? Murong Baoding's lips curled into a mocking smile. He did not dodge but raised his arms in front of his body. The sword edge brushed against Murong Baoding's silver armor and cut through iron like mud. However, after breaking through the armor, it fell on the sleeve of the Orange Province's disciplinary medallion. It was like fine iron hitting each other, producing an unusual sound of metal hitting stone. Murong Baoding furrowed his brows and retreated. He had made up his mind to exhaust Chai Ching-shan's qi bit by bit. His body was known as the Great Vajra Realm, which was 1 in a million among pure martial artists. It was said that his indestructible body was not inferior to that of the Dragon Tree monk and Li Dangxin, the master and disciple of the 2 Zen temples. More importantly, the armor he wore was one of the best treasures in Beimang's treasury. It was forged in the early Sweet Du period and was once a secret treasure of the royal family of Dafeng. It was said that its material was similar to the red armor of one of the 4 grandmasters of the spring and autumn period. With this armor, Murong Baoding originally thought that he could withstand 2 or 3 strikes from the peach blossom sword god Dong Tai, who had the greatest killing power. However, he did not expect Chai Ching-shan's sword to break through his armor. This made Murong Baoding retract his underestimation of the grandmasters of the Central Plains. In fact, Lu Fengshou, who was proficient in assassination, had made a good start but also a bad one. Li Fengshou almost killed Chai Qing-shan with his willow leaf sword. It was not because Chai Qing-shan was weak, but because his cooperation with Murong Baoding was flawless. Chai Qing-shan's swordsmanship was especially high. It was the best in the southeast of the Central Plains. If there were grandmasters of fist techniques in the world, other than Wei Miao, only the woman from the martial emperor's city, Linya, could hold her own. Then the sword forest of the Central Plains was just as Chai Qing-shan had said. It was continuous and unbroken. What a magnificent sight it was. It was not that there were no swordsmen other than Dong Tai, and it was not that there were no sword moves other than Li Chuangong's two-sleeves green snake. Since Murong Baoding was arrogant, Chai Qing-shan did not spare him. He chopped down with his sword like a waterfall. The sword aura in front of Murong Baoding was overflowing like a waterfall. Chapter 2012. Murong Baoding took a deep breath. Finally, he no longer hoped to rely on his priceless armor and Vajra physique to resist. His fists were as quick as lightning. His fists landed on the waterfall formed by the abundant sword chi, causing loud bangs to ring out. His fists shattered the sword chi, creating a scene of drifting clouds and scattering snow. Chai Qing-shan did not mind. He quickly stepped forward and thrust his sword forward. Although the 3-foot-long sword in his hand was aimed at Murong Baoding's forehead, at the same time, no less than 40 sword chi appeared around the green water sword between the two. The sword chi surged forward, but the sword intent was of the same origin. Chai Qing-shan had comprehended this sword when he was 30 years old. He had seen a spring in the old Dongyue kingdom. It was the third best spring in the world. The middle path was blocked by a protruding rock, causing the water to stagnate. Hundreds of thin streams of water flowed into the spring. Chai Qing-shan had once told 2 of his proud disciples that he could use 80 swords in one breath to turn Vajra into dust. Unfortunately, this sword master could only produce 40 swords in one breath at this time. Even so, the power of the sword was extremely grand and shocking. Murong Baoding snorted angrily. He actually wanted to retreat. As his burly figure retreated, he stretched out his arm. His 5 fingers were like hooks as he controlled his chi to grab a rider and his horse. He blocked the curtain of sword rain formed by the majestic sword chi. Chai Qing-shan's sword pierced the horse's head. With a light shake of his wrist, the pitiful horse and rider were instantly sent flying. Taking advantage of this opening, Murong Baoding was still one of Northern Mang's few martial arts masters after all. He heavily stepped out, stamped his foot, and took half a step back. The aura around his entire body instantly reached its peak. He was certain that Chai Qing-shan would definitely continue to charge forward, so he punched out towards the air in front of him. Facing Murong Baoding's overbearing fist aura, Chai Qing-shan and his sword did not stagnate. They continued to float forward. The old man tilted his body slightly and allowed the fist aura to explode his left shoulder. His sword was as fast as a rainbow as it accurately pierced Murong Baoding's chest. Injury for injury, death for death. Murong Baoding's chi sank into his dantian. At this moment, he realized that he had no power to fight back and chose to defend with all his might. The chi in his body circulated rapidly, and his face glowed with a dark yellow color. His feet were rooted to the ground, and he was as immovable as a mountain. The sword chi of the 3-feet-long sword pierced through the armor like a hot knife through butter. After the tip of the sword was pressed against Murong Baoding's chest, the long sword bent like a crescent moon. In the end, it was almost a full moon. Chai Qing-shan, whose shoulder had been shattered and whose body was covered in blood, laughed loudly. Scram! The tall and sturdy Murong Baoding was sent flying by the sword like a kite with its string cut. Murong Baoding's face turned pale after he landed heavily on the ground. He didn't lower his head to look at the old swordsman. He just stretched out his hand and wiped his face. His palm was scarlet red. Chai Qing-shan, who was surrounded by the Beimang cavalry, had no choice but to draw his sword and kill the horsemen who were swarming towards him. Thus, the line of sight between the two of them was blocked. Murong Baoding took the opportunity to slap the ground with his palm. He stood up again with some lingering fear in his heart. This old fellow was somewhat difficult to deal with. Murong Baoding, who didn't want to meet force with force, kept retreating, and said angrily, "Smash him to death." With Chai Qingshan at the center, the northern Mang cavalry began to rapidly charging forward. The horsemen at the outermost edge finally had the chance to show off the grassland cavalry's riding and archery skills. The aristocratic generals, who were frightened to death, had already given the order to kill regardless of whether they were friend or foe. Chai Qingshan, who had to stop the cavalry's charge and break through the rain of arrows, swung his sword like a dragon. When he was trapped in a hopeless situation, the old man still tried to break through the cavalry formation and chase after the governor of Orange Province who was avoiding the battle. However, his chi pulled at the wound on his chest, and the blood turned into a strange dark green color. He was only a hair away from rushing out of the encirclement that the Beimang cavalry had built with their lives. Murong Baoding, who had retreated again and again, had already retreated to the front of the Winter Thunder elite cavalry. His face was ferocious as he spat out a mouthful of blood. If it wasn't for the poison on his willow sword, he might have been chased to this place by Chai Qingshan. It didn't mean that he would lose. Murong Baoding still had the confidence to slowly exhaust this old man to death. However, how could Chai Qingshan's life be compared to his own? He paid more attention to Wei Miao. If that guy wanted to abandon Chai Qingshan and retreat to North Resisting City, with Murong Baoding's injury, he was confident that he could stop him. If one looked towards the north from North Resisting City's city walls, or if one looked towards the south from the Winter Thunder elite cavalry on horseback, they would see that the great circle the Elder was in had layers upon layers of northern Mang cavalry continuously charging towards the center of the circle. Chai Qingshan stood alone with his sword. There were corpses all around him and piles of bones. Murong Baoding suddenly raised his head. There was a sudden explosion, and then a figure fell from the sky. Murong Baoding could only tilt his head and cross his arms to block above his head. Half of Murong Baoding's body was smashed into the ground by this punch. It turned out that Wei Miao had directly jumped over the heads of the Beimang cavalry and found Murong Baoding. There was no way to retreat. Murong Baoding instinctively protected his head with his arms. Sure enough, Wei Miao pressed down on his head with one hand and sent out a knee strike. Murong Baoding was knocked back in a deep ditch several zhang long was plowed out. Dust flew up. In the yellow sand, Wei Miao's punch was so fast that people could only see a blur. The silver-armored Murong Baoding retreated again and again. Wei Miao's punch rose up and landed hard. The force was like a broken bow, and it was like a thunderclap. He forcefully opened Murong Baoding's door and burst out again and again. Finally, Wei Miao's punch was like holding a baby. The name of the move did not sound fierce, but in fact, it was the fiercest. The older generation of Jianghu fist masters had already concluded that after practicing this move for tens of thousands of times, the foundation could be seen, and the strength could reach the hair. Wei Miao was obsessed with fist practice. He never slacked off because of his outstanding talent. Since he learned this move when he was young, he practiced it diligently every day. When he entered the mountains, he destroyed huge trees. When he entered the water, he hammered the rivers. Perhaps he had already punched 1,000,000 times. His punch was like smashing a big bell, causing a loud bang. After Murong Baoding was flicked out by Chai Qingshan's sword, he had the advantage of time, place, and people. Once again, he was sent flying by Wei Miao's punch. Dozens of Winter Thunder elite cavalrymen who could not dodge in time were killed on the spot. This southern Zhao Marshal Dao Grand Master, who should have displayed extraordinary brilliance in the Central Plains Jianghu, on the battlefield outside northern Barricade City, under the gaze of several thousand northern Mang cavalry, beat Murong Baoding until he was in an extremely sorry state, his aura swaying. He had beaten Murong Baoding's armor until it was full of holes and almost completely destroyed. Murong Baoding, who was on the verge of collapsing, roared again. Wei Miao followed him like a shadow. He stretched out his left arm and circled it to Murong Baoding's ear. He placed his palm on Murong Baoding's temple and patted it casually. Murong Baoding, who was much taller than Wei Miao, was lifted off the ground. Wei Miao's right fist smashed into Murong Baoding's abdomen like a thunderclap. Murong Baoding's body, who was originally flying backward, was pulled back by Wei Miao's left hand and punched his abdomen again. It was a comical and tragic scene. Murong Baoding's body, which was hanging sideways in the air, did not fall to the ground. Wei Miao walked forward step by step and punched his abdomen repeatedly. Wei Miao's last punch, which was also the last punch of his life, landed heavily on Murong Baoding's abdomen. Murong Baoding finally fell to the ground. He was thrown 70 to 80 feet away, bleeding from his 7 orifices. The so-called invincible body, even with the protection of the armor, was still a big joke. Wei Miao stood proudly in the same place and gently turned his head to look back. He looked at the cavalry circle but could not see Chai Qing-shan, who had fought side by side until now. He raised his gaze slightly and looked at North Jibei City. It was destined that he could not see that graceful figure. Wei Miao's vision was gradually blurred by the blood that flowed out of his eyes. After Murong Baoding fell to the ground, he tried to get up but it was futile. He kept vomiting blood. He knew that Wei Miao was only a few punches away from taking his life. If both sides fought fair and square, Murong Baoding would not be able to contend against Wei Miao. At this moment, Murong Baoding no longer had the slightest thought about dominating the Jianghu of the Central Plains. Murong Baoding got up 3 times in a row but gave up halfway. He could only lie on the ground dejectedly. His face was pale and colorless. He had completely lost the ability to fight. This Bei Mang, whose heart was higher than the sky, held the edict with a bitter expression. He cursed softly, *CK the Jianghu of the Central Plains. Not far away, Wei Miao stood silently in the same place. Nanzhao Grandmaster Wei Miao, all the tendons and veins in his body were broken, but he did not fall down. Since the world fist has Wei Miao, how can I, Wei Miao, be afraid of death and withdraw my fists? There is no such reason. She was watching. Before Wei Miao died heroically in battle, the Bei Mang cavalry circle was strangely still. That old man had killed them until they were terrified. Moreover, the corpses of the cavalry and the warhorses had formed a natural barrier, which was not conducive for the cavalry to gallop and kill. The old swordsman, who had been hit by several arrows, spat out a mouthful of black blood. He knelt on one knee, using the long sword in his hand to support his body from falling. Chai Qing-shan did not want to die kneeling on the ground, but he also did not want to fall down and die. In the end, he sat cross-legged with the sword across his knees. Since the sword was named Green Water, the sword blade was naturally green, just like the spring scenery in Jiangnan of the Central Plains. The ripples of the sword light under the sunlight were just like the ripples of the Dongyue sword pool in the spring breeze. Chai Qing-shan used his sleeve to gently wipe off the black blood on the sword blade. Before the old man died, he smiled with a trembling voice. My Dongyue sword pool has been established for 500 years. With a sword in hand, I looked at the Jianghu. The mountains are high, the water is deep, and the sword aura is long. I, Chai Qing-shan, have never let the 3-foot sword be humiliated. After Qing Baishuang and Sui Shiegu, the 2 grandmasters of the Central Plains, Chai Qing-shan died in battle. Wei Miao followed him, silently meeting his death. Chapter 2013. The martial emperor cities Yu-Groom wielded the famed sword Fuji and charged directly at the 1,000 family elite cavalry. His sword fell. This sword was completely different from the previous one, which killed people with a light touch. It was brilliant, and the sword chi was so strong that it blotted out the sky. Wang Xianji, who was never willing to praise anyone, once joked with the green-robed girl that Yu-Groom was the only one who stood out among the tens of thousands of martial artists in Donghai. It was obvious that Wang Xianji had high expectations for Yu-Groom. More than 40 family elite cavalry were directly smashed by the swift and fierce sword chi. Blood and flesh splattered everywhere, and the scene was extremely bloody. One of the armored cavalrymen who should have died under the sword chi suddenly retreated and stepped on the warhorse's head accurately every time. He leaped like a rabbit and swooped down like a falcon on flat ground. In an instant, he pulled a large distance away from the unstoppable Groom and finally fell between two warhorses that continued to charge forward. He casually raised his arm and snatched a fine iron spear from the Zhong family disciple. With a smile on his face, he looked up at the young swordsman who was rapidly approaching him. The middle-aged man in the armor of an ordinary cavalryman thrust his spear out. The spear was like a giant dragon leaping out of the water, aiming at the Central Plains swordsman's heart. Spear immortal Wang Xiu, one of the 4 grandmasters of the spring and autumn period, had left the big arm manual that had been handed down for generations. It said, when the spear pierces a line, it will go straight. On the line, ghosts and gods will retreat. Every time Groom stepped on the warhorse's head, he would break the warhorse's front leg, raising a cloud of dust and completely disrupting the cavalry's formation. In the face of the middle-aged cavalryman's powerful spear, he suddenly lowered his body a little. He lowered his head and bent his waist, barely dodging the incomparably sharp tip of the spear. Then, he thrust out his sword, which also went straight. The cavalryman lurking among the Zhong family's private cavalry was Zhong Liang, known as the second person of the Devil Path in Beimang. In the face of Groom's evasive sword, he was still calm and collected. He pulled out his spear and retreated without hesitation. Zhong Liang didn't choose to confront Wang Xianji's first disciple head-on. Instead, he adopted a defensive stance, blocking and circling. The circle was less than a chu wide, and his defense was extremely methodical. Thus, even when faced with Groom's consecutive sword attacks, the sword aura alone strangled the riders charging from both sides of Zhong Liang. However, Zhong Liang still retreated calmly, showing the elegant demeanor of a great spear master. Although Groom's swordsmanship was profound and vaguely had the charm of a land sword immortal, and could be said to be aggressive, once an opponent of Zhong Liang's level chose to retreat shamelessly, it would be difficult for Groom to seize the opportunity and succeed. Moreover, Zhong Liang was originally recognized as a master of various schools in Beimang, and finally achieved a killing power that did not lose to the celestial state with the Finger Mystery Realm. But in the end, Zhong Liang, who did not have the Vajra physique, did not continue to blindly pursue killing power to reach the celestial state. Instead, he opened up a new path in spear arts, only taking the defensive position and not the offensive, striving to keep the enemy away from the tip of the spear. It should be known that besides being a prominent family of generals in Beimang, the Zhong family was also the only family of spear arts in the world. The Zhong family's disciples were brave and valiant. Regardless of gender or age, they were all skilled in spear arts, especially the big spear. Young children had to practice spear arts with a white wax pole in hand. After the initial success in spear arts, they had to reach the level of not letting water in. That was, the family's 10 riders would run in a circle at a distance of 30 paces, and the person holding the spear would have to deflect all the arrows that were shot at him. After that, in the heavy rain, brandishing the long spear so that his clothes were not wet in the slightest. Only then could he be considered to have reached the level of great success in spear arts. Therefore, the long spear iron cavalry under the command of Beimang's general Zhong Shintong, whether it was Dongzhuo's private cavalry, Murong Baoding's Winter Thunder elite cavalry, or the inferior Ruan iron cavalry, they were all inferior to the long spear iron cavalry. It was a pity that the Zhong family had only cultivated less than 2,000 iron cavalry in 20 years. Limited by their numbers, they were unable to have an absolute advantage on the battlefield. After the Beimang Empress saw the Zhong family's iron cavalry practice with her own eyes, she sighed, "The Zhong family's children are really like the grassland's eagles flying across the plains with iron spears in their hands." The Zhong family's second master, Zhong Liang, who had always been famous for deviating from orthodoxy and rebelling against orthodoxy in the grassland, chose spear arts as his martial arts, returned to the roots, to make up for his shortcomings in martial arts. This was unexpected but also reasonable. Groom Yu looked deeply at Zhong Liang, who was retreating again, and suddenly put away his Fu Ji. Zhong Liang then stopped and laughed. "You finally remembered to go back to help Lu Huang? Don't worry, first ask if the iron spear in my hand agrees or not." Zhong Liang held the spear in one hand, and his chi was firmly locked onto Groom Yu. For the first time, he really had the intention to fight. Then, he raised his arm and made a gesture. The two wings of the Zhong family's cavalry that were constantly rushing forward suddenly broke in half. The elite cavalry that stopped moving forward lined up behind Zhong Liang. At the same time, the Beimang cavalry that was originally at the rear turned over and fell off their horses. No less than 300 people rushed forward from the gap between the cavalry formation. There were the Spiderweb's elite men of sacrifice, Beimang's Jianghu masters, and even the Zhong family's consecrated guests who had been raised by the Zhong family for many years. Without exception, all of them, including Zhong Liang, stared at Grumyu, who was holding the long sword, and Fu Ji. The 300 people quickly formed a huge encirclement and desperately surrounded Grumyu, who had a cold blade at his waist and a long sword in his hand. Zhong Liang held his spear and stood in the same place. He saw more than 30 people taking the lead to surround and kill the sword genius from Liang's eastern sea. He smiled confidently. Grumyu, bullying with numbers is something we have no choice but to do. Although my Zhong family's men are not afraid to fight to the death, this is only on the battlefield. After all, we are not in Jianghu. I hope you can forgive us. This battlefield was exactly the same as the one where Murong Baoding and Li Fengshou were overseeing. How similar. Unexpectedly, Grumyu held the Fu Ji upside down, using only 2 fingers of his left hand as a sword. His lips moved slightly. The sword energy in Grumyu's left sleeve was abundant and overflowing. The 30 experts who were prepared to die were killed on the spot by the sword chi that rose from the ground without any warning, regardless of whether they were running wildly or leaping high into the air. Not only that, with Grumyu as the center, the sword energy suddenly rose from the ground, spectacular, like a big spring gushing out. This strange phenomenon was really like thunder rising from the ground. 100 feet, 200 feet, 300 feet, all of them were vast and mighty sword energy that rose into the sky. After the 30 Beimang experts that Grumyu purposely targeted died, there were 60-odd people who couldn't dodge in time or just happened to bump into the sword energy, dying with their eyes wide open. Apart from most of the Beimang people who were lucky enough to dodge the sword energy, in truth, the number of experts who could take the sword energy head-on could be counted on 2 hands. Zhong Liang was naturally the most relaxed. He just raised his spear and landed heavily, smashing the sword energy that rose from the ground beside him. Zhong Liang wasn't in a rush at all. The one who should be anxious was Grumyu. Lu Huang, who was at the end of his rope, faced the continuous charge of 3,000 cavalry. Apart from death, what else could he do? When the cavalry of the Zhong family entered the battlefield, Lu Huang would probably go and meet his master who made Jianghu bow to him for 60 years. Zhong Liang only needed to delay Grumyu at the crucial moment. If he could capture Grumyu alive, that would be the best. He didn't believe that his nephew, Zhong Tan, who was responsible for the prosperity of the family, had died at Miyun Mountain Pass. He was most likely imprisoned by Bailiang, most likely in Beiju City. Not only did Zhong Liang have high hopes for Zhong Tan, who had a similar temperament, but the entire Zhong family needed Zhong Tan alive. Otherwise, the Zhong family's 20 years of hard work and planning would all be for naught. Even if he and his brother Zhong Shentong achieved great military exploits in the future, without an heir, what benefit would it bring? Zhong Liang hoped that it would be used by Grumyu or someone else in exchange for Zhong Tan's chance to return to the family. Zhong Liang, who was in a complicated mood, suddenly looked around for no reason, as if he was looking for something. He was very curious. As a top guru with outstanding attainments in Xian Finger, he could feel a huge and suffocating invisible momentum, but he couldn't catch any clues. He only knew that Tuoba Bodhisattva had dragged the young king into a real dangerous battlefield. Ordinary people couldn't touch it at all, and even Zhong Liang couldn't see it. After this battle, the casualties of Bailiang's siege infantry would be beyond imagination, and it might even affect the future southern expedition to the Central Plains. Because of those 18 people, the Southern Dynasty's infantry that had been accumulated for 20 years would be long gone before they could break through Beiju City. At that time, the grassland cavalry would have to dismount and fight, and the casualties would only increase. Liang Mang and Bailiang knew that whether Beiju City could be defended or not depended on the number of the Southern Dynasty's infantry. This was also the reason why the 18 people didn't retreat. It was also the reason why Bailiang quickly sent out so many elite cavalry, and the cobweb men of sacrifice and Jianghu masters didn't hesitate to go all out. Killing one more southern dynasty infantry that was familiar with siege warfare would increase the chances of Bailiang's Beiju city. Zhong Liang, who was tenacious and indomitable, was at a loss for the first time. Why did this battle have to be so bleak? Shouldn't the millions of grassland cavalry have targeted Bailiang from the beginning? In the hinterland of Beimang, the broken spear in Deng Mao's hand was less than 2 feet long. At this time, it became more and more like a broken spear, with only a foot-long spearhead left. However, one of Xianyuan Qingfeng's sleeves was also shredded, and a ghastly wound appeared on her fair, jade-like arm. Blood flowed out incessantly. Deng Mao didn't let the purple-clothed man get within 50 steps of the crown prince of Beimang, but his palm was bloody and couldn't be said to have the upper hand.